Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Daryl Domitruk. I'm the Executive Director of the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, and I'd like to welcome you to Getting It Right, the annual crop production extension meeting sponsored by MPSG. Our purpose here today is to prepare attendees, be you a farmer or an agronomist working with a farmer, to look at the option of pulse and soybeans and to prepare to assist growers who've exercised the option of growing a pulse or soybean in 2022. There's an environment of high crop prices, obviously. We're still in an environment of uncertain moisture, even though in Manitoba, the snowpack is generally pretty substantial. We also know the certainty of high nitrogen prices and high prices for other inputs such as fuel. And then there's a long-term consideration of things like carbon emissions and certain policies and programs that'll be out to affect decisions in that regard. In addition, we intend here today to offer and ensure you're aware of some of the products and services that are available to farmers and agronomists from the Manitoba pulse and soybean growers to help support successful pulse and soybean enterprises across Manitoba in 2022. I'm going to go through a few items. First of all, the agenda. I'll go through a few items just to update you on some of the things and products and services that MPSG is offering. We'll move into a presentation by Dr. Jim House at the University of Manitoba on this question of soybean protein that anyone who's been involved in the soybean market knows that this is something that's of constant discussion. And kind of a special piece of the presentation this morning is hearing from Delmar Commodities, the biggest soybean crusher in Western Canada and a company that figures prominently in the future of this crop going forward. Switching over to peas, and after a 10-minute break, we have Dr. Syama Chatterton, who's an authority on Aphanomyces root rot in pulses, and she'll tell us the latest regarding scientific discoveries in that area. Following that, Dr. Tenuta from University of Manitoba is going to update us on the latest in soybean cyst nematode research and agronomy. And then our own Laura Schmidt, who's our MPSG production specialist in the western part of the province. We'll talk about some of the hot topics that have been uncovered through our very popular on-farm testing program. And so with that, I'll just update you a bit on what's happening in MPSG. First of all, our team that you as agronomists or farmers are more likely to interact with. This team's supported by folks in the back office, as it were, but the people you will see, hopefully, on the highways and byways of Manitoba this summer. Leanne and Ian run our on-farm testing program, and we'll talk a bit about that later. Cassandra, who was an agronomist with us for quite a while, is now running our research program. And if you're in the research field, you may run into Cassandra. Laura, who you'll hear from later this morning, is our agronomist in the western part of the province. And we actually have a vacancy right now in the eastern part of Manitoba. And if any one of you are interested in a position with Manitoba pulse and soybean growers as an agronomist, anyone interested, or you know of someone who's interested in practicing agronomy from Highway 34 to the Ontario border, supporting pulse and soybean growers, we have a posting available on the Agrologist Manitoba website, as well as the University of Manitoba website, and a couple of commercial job posting websites. As you can see, everyone in our team looks happy, and a couple of them even got free hats. So if you're interested, let us know. MPSG is active in a couple of areas. One is in research, and I just want to indicate that we do research across a spectrum of scientific inquiry. So as depicted by the picture on the left, we work with researchers who work in labs to discover and uncover new knowledge of upstream phenomena. If you want to improve soybeans or pulse crops or any crop, sometimes you got to dig deep and you have to look at what fundamentally is going on at the genetic and biochemical level. But then we also move that knowledge into the next phase of research, which depicted in the second picture at the top. And this is often what many people are used to, is the small plot kind of research that happens at research stations, etc. But in MPSG, we also take that information and scale it up to our on-farm network, research network, where we work with farmer members to actually conduct replicated studies right on their farms, mimicking the time, labor, and financial constraints that most farmers face in examining the suitability of new technologies. But a big part of our program is extension. There's no use doing research if you're not going to extend it. And that's what today's event is really about. And so we have a range of extension tools that we make available to folks like you, both in hard copy, electronic, and in-person format. And with the receding of the pandemic, we hope to step up our program in-person field days and winter events. So hopefully getting it right next year will be back to its in-person format. So in the research realm, we have kind of 4 areas of focus. In the middle is our vision of Manitoba farms sustainably producing profitable, quality pulse and soybean crops. But we do that, we drive forward in that by conducting research in 4 areas. Innovative, improving pest control, driving the market demand for pulses and soybeans, building soil health, and increasing yield and quality. So this research program is carried out at a number of locations by a number of agencies. So a lot of our upstream research that's conducted in laboratories or even in the field, but to find out what's going on, what's making things tick at the molecular and genetic level, is our partners at the University of Manitoba and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Those are our typical research partners. However, we're also doing quite a bit of work with groups like Brandon University, University of Saskatchewan, and other universities that you may not normally associate with agriculture, like the University of Winnipeg, and universities across Canada, like Laval in Quebec. Moving up in scale, a lot of our small plot kind of research occurs at the diversification centers across Manitoba that are supported by the Manitoba Department of Agriculture. We also have the University of Manitoba Agronomist in Residence program, which is involved at this scale of research. Assiniboine College is really building their agriculture research program, and we're part of that. And Red River College, especially in their food technology area, we do work with them on occasion. And then our on-farm network, where all of this is scaled up to really work at the farm level, that's driven by our own staff working with our own members on farms. A little bit on the agronomist in residence program at the University of Manitoba. It's been around for a number of years now and has generated quite a bit of information. And Kristen is our agronomist in residence stationed at the U of M. And she's been working in soybeans, peas, and dry beans and some very practical projects with dealing with things like seeding depth and integrated weed management and managing nutrients, inoculants, nitrogen fertilizer rates in dry beans, residue management. So there's a growing body of work that you can access that's come out of the agronomist in residence program, and it has real practical meaning. And so if we can help you access any of that, please give us a call. Of course, we extend the information a lot still in hard copy, and there's 2 publications I want to draw your attention to. One is Pulse Beat, the Science Edition, which comes out on an annual basis and really is a report on all of the research that we do. And those pages on the right side of the screen really show what you can expect when you open the cover of the Science Edition. It's very direct and straightforward reporting on research projects that we funded. We also publish research results in Pulse Beat, which comes out a couple of times a year and includes a number of things, including research reports, but also talks about things going on in the industry. And all of our members receive Pulse Beat, but these magazines are also posted to our website. The on-farm network has been going, well, it'll be its 10th going into its 10th year in 2022. And these black dots on the map depict the places where on-farm trials have occurred over the last 10 years. So you can see it's an extensive network of research projects that have occurred on farms, exposing questions about production to the real considerations of labor, time, equipment, et cetera, that farmers face. The on-farm network has worked in a range of projects in all of our crops, anything from testing biologicals and inoculants to seeding rates and fertility in terms of what our pulse and soybean crops require, tillage trials, comparing fungicides. A broad range of those kinds of trials have occurred in the last 10 years. And the results are available on our website. We've got a unique on-farm network database where you can go on and select the topic, the region of the province that you'd like to see and examine the trials that have gone on. Now, lately, and just to underline, those results are all available on our website in an interactive graphic format. Lately, we've also posted videos that go into a little more graphic detail about some of these trials and provide you with a pictorial and voiceover report on the various trial results. So I really encourage you to go onto our website and check out the on-farm trial database and videos. Now, a big thing that we've continued to do is develop hard copy and posted to the website digital versions of fact sheets. So this is kind of a new version of an old standard extension tool. In this case, this year, a new one is a guide to conducting on-farm trials. So if you're interested as an agronomist in working with a farmer, or if you're interested as a farmer in doing your own on-farm trials, we've developed a resource for you here that's available on the website and in hard copy. A few, just to run down some of the production resources that are available in this format. For soybeans, we've done everything from growth staging and plant development guide, fertility fact sheet, seed treatment risk assessment. A new one this year is our aphid guide to IDing and scouting and managing soybean aphids. In field peas, again, we've got general production guidelines, growth staging and maturity guides. We've got a few new ones, organic production guidelines for those interested in organic pea production, perhaps for delivery to Roquette. We've got fungicide decision worksheet and a desiccation and harvest guide for field peas. And here's examples of those. Here's the organic field pea guidelines. Here's the fungicide decision worksheet that shows you, in nice pictures that the distinction between ascochyta blight and bacterial blight, and a scorecard to make informed fungicide decisions. And here's the important field pea desiccation guide with the sensitivity around glyphosate residues in crops. These guidelines are more important now than ever, and we try and provide a very detailed and informative fact sheet on how to apply desiccants to post and pre-harvest weed control products to our pulse crops. In dry beans, similarly, we've got staging guides and insects and disease scouting calendars and fungicide decision support materials. And a new one this year, again, is the desiccation guide. Again, beans are one market that's particularly sensitive and to glyphosate residues and other chemical residues, and we need to do a good job of making sure we follow the rules. And in faba beans, a small but I think growing crop, we've developed an insect and disease scouting calendar for those of you who may either grow or work with farmers who are growing faba beans. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our variety trials. It's a very extensive program. We had 58 trials last year and 38 soybean, 8 dry bean, 10 field pea, and 2 faba bean trials. We do this along with Dennis Lang at Manitoba Agriculture, and all that data is reported in our pulse and soybean variety guide that comes out every year in the November-December period. So I encourage you to consult that guide if you still have questions on varieties. Finally, we've really increased the number of videos that we've developed based on the fact that our agronomists will walk over 120, 130 fields every year, taking pictures and videos about things they see and posting them to our website. Things like staging and assessing plant stands, IDing pests, desiccation timing, and a whole lot more. So there's a lot of video resources available at manitobapulse.ca and on YouTube. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. James House from the Food and Human Nutritional Sciences Department in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. Just a reminder that you can post questions in the chat, and we've got a number of, we've got some people that are monitoring the chat, and we'll curate and relay those questions to our speakers. After James, we will move straight into a Delmar presentation. So we're not going to waste any time, in between. We'll move from presentation to presentation, and then after the second presentation, there'll be a 10-minute break. So if I can, James, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you very much. And on behalf of MPSG, its directors and members, I hope you have an informative morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. I'll just share my screen now. And just get confirmation that everybody can see the presentation.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Daryl, and thanks for that introduction. Again, my name is Jim House. I'm a professor in the Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences. I'm also cross-appointed to the Department of Animal Science at the University of Manitoba. And for the last several years, we've been conducting research in association with, in partnership with Manitoba pulse and soybean growers, looking at the evaluation of protein quality of Western Canadian soybeans. And so the work I'm going to present today represents an overview of some of the research that was conducted by a master's student of mine, Dashi, who completed his program last year. And we'll also introduce you to some research that we're conducting to look at the feeding value, and that work is being led by a postdoc in my lab, Mohammed Nejat. But just to get us started, and Daryl mentioned this, and looking at the soybean protein deficit, as it were, in Western Canada. But to set the stage, in 2020, Manitoba soybean production accounted for about 18% of Canadian production, which was really only second to Ontario. And those numbers have shifted over the last couple of years, principally due to pricing and concerns about moisture levels. But in general, we're seeing significant production of Western Canadian soybeans, principally in the province of Manitoba. And the average yield is about 2,500 kilograms per hectare, compared to about 3,500 in Ontario. So you can see there's a bit of a yield lag, principally due to the varietals that are grown in Manitoba, as we're in the more northern climates. And so we're dealing with those 000 varieties that are better suited for the heat units that we have in the province of Manitoba. But with that, there's a recognition that protein levels have traditionally been lower in Western Canadian soy. And so the graph on the right there highlights this. And this is data from the Canadian Grain Commission that was available on their website. And you can see that the Eastern Canadian soy levels and the overall Canadian soy levels are higher than what we'd expect in Western Canada. But there is some evidence of a trend, a downward trend in protein levels in other regions, while the levels in Western Canada fluctuate and around about a 2% to 2.5% deficit in protein content on average over the last, say, 10 to 15 years. So this recognition of this protein deficit has proved challenging for the sector. It's led to reductions in prices that are being paid to farmers as a result of this protein deficit. In particular, we're seeing deficits of on a 13% moisture level, if you're getting protein levels lower than 34%, producers have experienced reductions in the pricing that they've received for the soybean crops. And so what this has a chilling effect on soybean production, but it also has a chilling effect on the capacity for processing. So it's limiting the opportunities for expansion of the soy processing sector for livestock feed. I just did some back of the envelope type of calculations for how much soy we could actually utilize in this province, in particular for feed. And if you look at hog producers are primarily utilizing about 2 million tons of feed. Roughly, if that's 500,000 tons of potential soybean utilization, that would equal 40% of total production in Manitoba. So there's significant capacity to expand locally produced soybeans into the livestock sector in this province. And so what we need is evidence to support the feeding value of the soybean that's being produced. And so as I mentioned, the soybean protein level has traditionally been the focus for quality and setting pricing levels. But there's been a significant interest in looking beyond the quantity of protein and focusing more on the quality of the protein. And when I'm talking about quality, what we're really talking about are two primary components. One is the amino acid composition of that protein. Those are the nutrients that animals actually need. So protein is made up of individual amino acids, and animals require a source of dietary amino acids, which is found in that protein in order to produce muscle, produce eggs, produce milk, etc. So there are certain key amino acids that are really important. In particular, if you're looking at balancing feed rations, soybean meal is traditionally used as a complement to the cereal grains, such as corn and wheat, barley, which tend to be deficient in certain amino acids, such as lysine and tryptophan. So soybean meal is used as a complement to bring in those essential amino acids. And so if the focus is turned away from just the actual crude protein level to the actual nutrient in question, which are those key amino acids, then you can start seeing some opportunities to really take advantage of an understanding of the full amino acid or quality value of that meal. So we need to understand the factors that affect protein and amino acid contents. And so our lab is focused on looking at agronomic factors, genetic factors. We spent a lot of time looking at processing factors, not only for soy, but also for other pulse crops. So in particular, peas and lentils. But what we've come to appreciate is that with all of these factors, the treatment combinations are extensive, and we require new approaches for the assessment of protein and amino acid contents that are rapid and economical. Protein is relatively straightforward to measure. Amino acids are not. So if we just look at the traditional methods for measuring protein and amino acid content, as I mentioned, there's fairly routine methods for measuring nitrogen content, the Kjeldahl and Dumas. The Dumas combustion method is relatively straightforward, as is the Kjeldahl method. Essentially, it's just multiplying nitrogen by 6.25 to get a crude protein content. And most labs will run this analysis for you. And so it's fairly routine. Amino acid analysis, on the other hand, it's far more complex. It requires multiple what are called hydrolysis. So you have to break up that protein to release the amino acids, free them so that you can actually measure them with some fairly sophisticated technological apparatus, such as gas chromatography, and in the case of what we use is what's called UPLC, or ultra high performance liquid chromatography. These methods are involved and time consuming, and actually require multiple analysis. To get the full spectrum of amino acids within a protein, you actually have to perform 3 separate hydrolysis steps. So it's time consuming. Sample analysis like this can be upwards of $400 to $500 per sample at a minimum to get the full spectrum of analysis. So it's expensive as well. And so that's one of the reasons why we've seen limited utilization of amino acid levels in sort of assessing quality, in particular in breeding programs when you're dealing with low amounts of material, and that's fairly precious because you need it to include in your breeding programs. But the costs can be prohibitive for actually understanding amino acids. And so for that reason, most of the efforts today is focused on protein when it has been considered. But the one technique that is proving to be useful for looking at composition of ingredients, including grains, oilseed meals, pulses, is the use of what's called near-infrared or NIR reflectance spectroscopy. Essentially what it uses is electromagnetic radiation between 750 and 2500 nanometers. And you're in essence measuring how much light is reflected by the substance. And you're comparing that spectra of reflectance to the actual composition that is determined using the traditional wet chemistry analysis. And you can actually develop calibration equations to determine, using a fairly simple technique, NIR technique, the actual composition of a particular ingredient in question. And so its protein and moisture content have been measured by NIR for years. Amino acids have been measured by NIR as well, but it hasn't reached a level of understanding and sophistication to really appreciate how amino acids change, in particular as a function of processing or other agronomic conditions. So the benefits of using NIR is that it's fast. It's literally seconds to run a sample. It's a fairly simple operation and it's environmentally friendly. It's really just put a sample in a cup, measure the reflectance, and if you've got your calibration equations set up, then you can actually get data generated by the actual unit, the NIR unit immediately. It does take a lot of work to set up the methods though, and that's where the stage that we're at is developing the calibration equations so that we actually have accurate methods for measuring the amino acid and protein contents. It can measure several values at the same time. So you can measure in a single run protein, moisture, all of the amino acids. Depending on what's in your calibration curve, you can go beyond that. You can start looking at some anti-nutritive factors, for example. And it's a non-destructive analysis. That's important if you're looking at in breeding programs, for example, and you have limited quantities of seeds that are available to you. You can actually, this method is non-destructive, and so you can actually scan the sample, and then the samples can go back and be used in a breeding program. So with funding from Manitoba pulse and soybean growers, and in association with fundings that we've received from Western Grains Research Foundation and the CAP program through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Manitoba and the province of Manitoba, we set up a research program to develop and evaluate NIR models for measuring the protein and amino acid contents of Manitoba grown soybeans. And these were soybeans that were derived from the varietal trials that Daryl mentioned. Within this program, we're exploring the effects of genotype, environment, and genotype by environment interactions on soybean protein and amino acid contents. And a second part of our program is another research project that we established to determine the feeding value of Western soybeans for monogastric species. So not only are we evaluating the composition of the soybeans, but we're actually looking at the feeding value of Western soybean meal for monogastric species. So I'll just go over a little bit of the research that we've generated through this program. In terms of the methodological approach, over the last, so 2018, 19, and 2020 cropping years, we looked at over 200 genotypes from the varietal locations that were established in Manitoba. In total, we scanned 7,147 soybean samples that we retrieved from these samples. So it just highlights the amount of material that can be done in a relatively short period of time. To try to do that number of samples for wet chemistry analysis would take years. But scanning with NIR, we were able to scan over 7,100 soybean samples over the last 3 years. We're using a PerkinElmer DA7250 NIR system, and so this is a partnership that we have with PerkinElmer for this type of research as well. There are other units that can be used, but in our work, we're using a DA7250 NIR system. We conduct reference chemistry on a subset of 520 samples. So we did all of the wet chemistry on those 520 samples that represented a range of protein contents. So that allowed us to have the wet chemistry data that we needed to establish the calibration curves for our NIR system. And then once we had that, we did, as part of Dashi's master's project, he looked at genotype by environment analysis on in 4 different locations in Manitoba. on soybean samples where he had for the same varieties grown in the same locations in 2 cropping years. And so as a result of that analysis, he had 23 genotypes in 4 different locations that he was able to have a complete data set for in both 2018 and 2019. So I'll highlight some of that data that was derived out of his thesis. So this figure represents the crude protein content on a dry matter basis, Manitoba soybeans grown in 2018, 19, and 2020. And what I've shown here on the left is just the crude protein on a dry matter basis, and it's comparing the conventional, so this would be more the food grade soybeans, to the GM soybeans, principally the glyphosate tolerant soybeans that were grown. And what can be seen here is that there was differences by year. Certainly the years that we have on questions are probably the 3 driest years in recent memory. And we were seeing protein content on average just a little over 40% on a dry matter basis, and highest in 2019. But you do see that the glyphosate tolerant varietals have a lower protein content than the conventional. And so that was persistent across all 3 cropping years. On this graph on the right, it's the same data, but it's meant to reflect the variation that we see. And so you can see the 18 conventional and glyphosate tolerant, 19 and 20 conventional and glyphosate tolerant. And this type of graph just highlights the number of data points that happen at a particular protein content. And you can see with this graph the min and max. And so, for example, in the glyphosate tolerant in 2018, we were getting protein levels as low as 26% crude protein on a dry matter basis. That's very low protein content. And again, we were finding fairly low protein contents in some varietals grown in 2020 as well in the glyphosate tolerant. But at the same time, you can also find varietals where protein content, and in particular in the conventionals, we're getting fairly high. Like in one of our conventionals in 2019, we had a protein content that was 58% on a dry matter basis. So very high protein content. So it does highlight the potential for variability. And with that knowledge, it will allow the breeding companies to identify those varietals that have high protein content and see how well they do from other agronomic perspectives within the province. In particular, if we hope to expand the utilization of soybean within the province for monogastric feeding. This is showing you the statistics of an NIR calibration models. And so the red line across is where we hope to have the R-squared. Now I just highlight that this is just one method of determining goodness of fit of calibration models. It's an R-squared. It's a fairly conventional method, but I've been cautioned by experts in the field of NIR not to rely solely on just one method of determining goodness of fit. But this method is a fairly standard approach. And you can see that for most of the amino acids, we were getting above a goodness of fit of 0.7. We still have issues for certain amino acids, in particular the ones that tend to be a little bit limiting in soybeans and tryptophan and some of the sulfurs. But we're fine. This is only 2 years of data. Third year data has not been included in this analysis yet. And we're finding that the fit is improving as we get more data into our calibration curve. But it does highlight that, yes, this method works, but we have to be mindful that that this is not the gold standard method for measuring amino acids, but you have to take the advantages with the limitations. And so I would argue that the advantages of using NIR for rapid assessment of soybean and protein quality exceeds the disadvantages. Now, as part of, as I mentioned, Dashi's master's thesis, he looked at soybean protein versus genotype, and we've just anonymized these particular genotypes, but it's a mix of conventional and glyphosate tolerance, and I think you could probably pick out the conventional varietals or those that are about 47% protein on a dry matter basis. But you're seeing that across, so this is 2 years of data, and multiple locations. So this is across locations as well. And you can see that there's general reasonable persistence of the protein content of the genotypes within the varietals, or sorry, within the locations. And so there is the potential for identification of which varietal will tend to perform better under which environmental conditions. But for the most part, what we experienced was that there was general persistence, is that there wasn't a number of interactions, only for a few varietals that we actually see interactions between genotype and environment. Again, this is an anonymized location, just to highlight data for 4 different locations and the different cropping years. And again, it showed that of all the varietals, they were fairly persistent across the 4 environments in 2018, but we did experience in 2019 more variability. And in fact, in one of the locations, location 1, gave higher, all the varieties tended to give higher protein levels in that location, and likely was a function of precipitation and heat available within that particular location. What I wanted to focus on now is that critical amino acid value, turning away from thinking about protein and focusing on those 5 critical amino acids, lysine, tryptophan, threonine, and then the sulfur amino acids, methionine and cysteine. And just an understanding that those amino acids are important from a complementary standpoint to cereal grains when we're formulating diets for monogastric animals in particular. And one of the things that is evident is that in general, the critical amino acid value is inversely proportional to the protein content. So if you have a higher protein, you tend to have a lower critical amino acid value. And so having high protein may not always mean that you have a higher protein quality or a higher feeding value as it relates to protein. And this is what was showing in these slides. And so if you're in particular, you can see here that the glyphosate tolerant varieties tended to have a higher critical amino acid value. And so I think that speaks volumes for the varietals that are grown in Manitoba, is that it's, even though they might have lower protein content, the glyphosate tolerant varietals have a higher content of those critical amino acid values, and that was persistent across all 3 cropping years. And there was differences due to cropping year as a function for those critical amino acid values. And then on the right, the same type of figure that you can see is that the variation that you find with some values getting fairly low down to close to 0.11. But again, in 2018, we had some varietals that were very high in those limiting amino acids as a function of total protein. So just a different way of looking at the quality of the protein within soybeans. And this is the final compilation data that shows the relationship between crude protein and critical amino acid value of Manitoba soybeans. So this really does highlight that it's inversely related. It's an R squared of about 0.56, and it's a negative slope. There's 7,147 data points in this curve, and it's consistent. The critical amino acid value is inversely related to crude protein content. So this is important for livestock feed formulation, which is less reliant on crude protein. Most of the major feed formulators are focusing on digestible amino acids. That's another component that we're adding into our analysis, because we have the capacity to look at in vitro protein and amino acid digestibility. And so that's something that we're working with, and we are just in a discussion with a major feed formulator to look at some of the models that they have, so that we can model what effect Manitoba protein and amino acid content might have on the overall feeding value and also performance of livestock species. And it's also important to consider amino acid content for soy evaluation. Finally, I just wanted to highlight another study that we have on the go, and one of our partners is you'll hear from next, is really looking at the need to understand the feeding value of Western Canadian soy meal for livestock species. And so with funding from MPSG and CAP, We have a major study that's underway looking at the use of extruded soybean meal. And so we secured soybean meals that are low protein, high protein, as well as a commercial protein level, more in the mid-range. And that was supplied by Delmar Commodities. And we also secured an Eastern soybean meal from Ontario, and that was supplied by Grand Valley Fortifiers using the same similar processing conditions. It was an extrusion technology. And what we're doing is we're assessing protein and amino acid digestibility and the overall feeding value for swine, pullets, laying hens, and broiler chickens. These studies are underway with the results expected in fall of 2022. And so again, this is a major study, and we're hoping that with the data that we're deriving here, it will allow us not only in combination with the analytical data that we have from our NIR program, we'll be able to more accurately assess the feeding value of soybean meal. And this will hopefully lead to a better understanding of the use of extruded soybean meal and highlight opportunities and also potentially lead to increased production and utilization of locally grown soybeans for use in the livestock sector. So in conclusion, the focus on crude protein alone does not account for the contribution of important amino acids for livestock feeding. NAR provides a rapid and cost-effective tool for measuring protein quality in soybeans. This can be used in crop breeding programs, and as I mentioned, our soybean work is also is well underway, and we're also working with collaborators in Saskatchewan on peas and on lentils. And so these programs are going to help us to advance the breeding efforts to look at pulse and soybean crops that have a higher quantity of those limiting amino acids, both for animal and for human food purposes. Because NAR is rapid and it's robust, does not require a lot of training, and is well suited to sort of more aggressive environments, it does open up the potential for assessment of protein quality at time of sale. That's another option, is that you can actually scan inputs coming in, and you can actually determine the amino acid content of the crop as on entry. That is the potential. We still need to continue to understand the factors influencing soy protein quality, and will, again, as I mentioned, will assist the sector in positioning varieties best suited for Western Canada. Just to acknowledge a number of the contributors I've listed there from my lab. I'd like to thank Daryl from MPSG for helping us to coordinate all of these studies with his team, and Emily Moore from Elmer with their support on the NIR platforms, and then our funding partners that were listed there, including the CAP program, Western Grains, Manitoba Pulse Soybean Growers, and Elmer. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the team. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Dr. House. There are a couple of questions here. The questions are, were there any trends between maturity group and seed protein? What about cultivar leaf shape and seed protein?
Thanks for your question. These are really important questions. Unfortunately, at this stage, we've not analyzed, at least within our team, the other agronomic traits. And this is something that with the data that we're positioning to MPSG, that I would like to look at in terms of the relationship between protein and some of the other agronomic traits. And so this is something that we envisioned as working together as a partnership with the research team at MPSG to look at those other agronomic traits that we can link in with the quality traits.
Thanks. Are there any other questions before we move on? Oh, he says, thank you very much. Great presentation, Dr. House.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Looks good.
All right. Hey, we're getting this figured out. Good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Friesen. Really appreciate the invite. Daryl and Laura, thank you for having us on to share a little bit about what we do here at Delmar Commodities in Jordan Mills. Thank you, Dr. House, for your presentation. I found that very interesting. It's also very reassuring to hear that there are people much smarter than myself looking at the problems that we are seeing every day, and some of the challenges that we have in the protein business here in Manitoba. So thank you for that. Very informative. So again, yeah, my name is Keith Friesen. I've been with Delmar Commodities now for 18 years. Grew up on a small farm north of Winnipeg near the thriving metropolis of Riverton, Manitoba. And yeah, been with Delmar for a long time. Actually started working at Jordan Mills. So I've seen the inside, the good, bad, the ugly, got my hands dirty there. And it's a favorite part of our business here for myself. Along with me here and listening in are a couple of my colleagues, Dale Hyde, Managing Director of Delmar Commodities, and Nolan Giesbrecht, who is the meal and oil sales manager for Jordan Mills. So in case I go off track or say something extremely incorrect, I'm hoping they're going to jump in and help me out a little. All right, so as far as what I do at Delmar, I spend most of my time working on soybean procurement for the mill, and I spend very little time working on PowerPoint presentations. So I do apologize. Please bear with me on this one, but we'll make it through together. All right. So Delmar Commodities, Jordan Mills, Ceres Global Ag, all these names, I figured I'd explain a little bit about who we are. So Delmar Commodities has been in the grain business in Manitoba for like 25 years, I believe. Various businesses, including the grain elevators, bird food packaging plant at St. Agathe, and more relevant to today, the crush plant at Jordan Corner. And also Ceres Global Seeds is a distributor for Western Canada, the exclusive distributor of Savita International brand soybean seed. So we do have a very vested interest in the soybean industry health and growth in Manitoba. A very vested interest right from the seed production right to the feed. And I should mention as well that Ceres Global Seeds also distributes Horizon brand corn seed as well. All right, so just a few generic points here regarding what we do at Jordan Mills. And how it's different than maybe what a typical soybean crush plant that you might have seen or heard of in the past. So generic crush plant, viable, very large scale, requires quite a large capital investment. I wrote 750,000 metric ton annually here, but the new plant at Spiritwood, I believe, is twice that. So it requires quite a large footprint, and not one that we currently believe Manitoba can sustain on about 1 million tons annually of production. Our extrusion crush plant can be feasible on a much smaller scale. So Jordan Mills, we're currently at 100,000 tons annual production. This has increased quite drastically over the last couple of years, a series of expansions. So going back to 2019, Delmar Commodities was purchased by Ceres Global Ag, and with that came an increased desire to grow our footprint here in Manitoba. And so we've just completed a large expansion this last year to bring us up over 100,000 metric ton. The products, the meal and the oil that we produce, the meal is all sent to hog, poultry, and dairy operations in Western Canada. So that's throughout Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, all via truck, and all very much on an on-time delivery basis. So you can imagine the freight department has its hands full, keeping all those trucks coming in and out just on time. And so that's full of its own challenges every day. The oil itself goes to via tanker truck also throughout Western Canada, also into the northern Midwest states and into lower mainland BC. And yes, that's mostly all used for feed, although there is some growing demand for renewable diesel and using that as an energy source for that. So yeah, that's where our products go. So generic crush plant, as you probably are aware, the soybeans are soaked in solvent to extract 100% of the oil. At our extrusion crush plant, the soybeans are extruded at a very particular temperature and time. If they aren't cooked at a high enough temperature, the anti-nutritional factors are not properly denatured. And if it's overcooked, we encounter some feeding issues as well with the protein binding, and Nolan can share more about that if I misspoke. But yes, through this extrusion process, the soybeans undergo a series of pressure changes, very drastic pressure changes that allows the oil itself to be separated. Once through the extruder, the resulting mash, it's very steamy, very hot, looks like porridge. This product is then pressed, where we can remove about 2/3 of the oil. So if a raw soybean has, let's say 18% oil, we remove about 2/3 of that, and the resulting meal, the cake that's left over, is ground. That meal has about 7% fat. So generic soybean meal that most feed mills are used to importing from the States will be around 46 to 47% protein, and our meal is generally about 42%, although as Dr. House explained, the variability year over year can move that around, and that does create some problems. Obviously, the feed industry relies on a very consistent product. So to some of the things that we see as opportunities for growth and challenges, figured I would share with the group. As you have all heard by now, I'm sure, there are supply chain issues and trucking issues and border issues, and a local reliable source of protein for our feed industry has value, and I think more and more people are realizing the value of that. And so we feel we are placed, in a good position to serve that market. The livestock industry, Western Canada, is growing. The demand is there for protein. The interest is there, especially this year with all the different challenges we've had. There's quite a bit of interest in the product we create, and so we do see this as an opportunity for Manitoba to potentially grow further from 100,000 tons. Like I said, the demand is there. I think Dr. House mentioned 500,000 ton into Manitoba for just the hog industry alone, but we're looking at the poultry, the dairy as well, and for the 3 prairie provinces. So the demand side of the equation, we feel is an opportunity for growth. Some of the challenges. So again, we talked a little bit about the protein variability. So where consumers do rely on a very consistent product as they formulate their rations. The variability year over year has created some hesitancy in the past in some of the lower years. I know, Dr. House, you were talking about dry matter protein values. We, I guess, look at the, as tested at the raw soybean itself. And so we're seeing numbers from 29 to 37 is a bit of an extreme range of some of the proteins we've seen over the years. And consistency would help, of course, but I understand a lot of this is outside of our control and perhaps weather dependent. So other challenges, of course, these consumers that are buying our product are buying a protein, and when we are running about 5% deficient to a U.S. imported protein, that is a value loss to them. So it becomes a disadvantage. It obviously factors into inclusion rates and by extension profitability for our consumer, and then for us. So that is a challenge there. And expanding to consume more than 10% of Manitoba's soybean production would require paying up. And I'm sure the farmers on here would agree that's a great idea. And we wouldn't mind as long as it stays viable, of course. And so the moving to greater than 10%, we do feel today is a challenge. And so we're hoping to see acres increase again. Love to get back to 2 million acres, and potentially we could increase our crush over at Jordan Corner as well. All right, figured I'd show a little slide just to show everyone what soybean oil futures have been doing. So for a long portion of time, futures were hovering around 30 to 35 cents per pound US for veg oil. That was just kind of a normal range. Last year, we've seen that almost double. And so this chart that you're looking at here, I believe, is about 1 year, just over 1 year. And now in the last 3 months, we've seen it take off again. So there is an opportunity here for our soybean growers in Manitoba to capitalize on this energy, the growth and value of the oil, and that's exciting. It is also a challenge. Since our soybean oil for our plant is consumed basically 100% currently into the feed market, you can't just expect everyone to pay twice as much for their feed oil either, when there's potentially other energy options as well. So as the crush margin paradigm changes from more of the value moving to oil away from meal, that is a bit of a challenge for us locally here in Manitoba. However, again, I do think this is going to be a net positive. I know Dale here has spent many hours of his life going through red tape and trying to be able to access some of the renewable diesel markets that are exploding, I would say, in North America. There's a reason we're seeing crush plants being announced everywhere. Everyone wants a piece of the action, and we do hope that we can partake in that excitement as well in the future. So, yeah, I think at this point that's kind of a very brief overview of what we do. If anyone has any questions, I figured Mr. Bean was an appropriate picture for the soybean mill. If anyone has any questions, I would love to be able to do my best to answer them. And if not, I can turn this back over to the group.
Doesn't look like there's any questions, but we'll give it another minute or so.
All right, well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. All right, we're coming up on 10 o'clock, so we will take that 10-minute break and we'll be back at 10 after. All right, everybody, it's 10 after 10, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Chatterton, and she is going to get started.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Just putting it into presentation mode here. Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
You bet.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, good morning. My name is Syama Chatterton. I'm a pulse crop pathologist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research and Development Center. And I'm here this morning to talk to you about my favorite topic, Aphanomyces root rot. So we'll start with just setting the scene for who the players are in our root rot scenario, and I've called them the root robbers because really what they do is they remove the roots and the nodules and everything that's good about pulse crops, and cause damage to the roots and then resulting in a yield impact. So we have a number of different players. So I have our kind of starring role here as Aphanomyces eutyches, and kind of our supporting players would be Fusarium avinaceum and Fusarium solani. And then there's also a number of other fungal species that are involved, a number of pythiums, Fusarium and Rhizoctonia. So it can be quite a complex system that makes it more difficult to manage. And I have here at the bottom of my movie poster, you know, that this is really produced by wet soil, pulse history, and tight rotations is what really helps these root rot robbers in their starring role. And then pulses, I think we all know, kind of framed here as our innocent victims. As said, we really get a lot of benefit from pulse crops in our rotations because of this nodulation, but they don't need fertilizer, very efficient water users. And because they fix their own nitrogen, they actually leave nitrogen behind in the soil for subsequent crops. So really they are an essential component of sustainable agriculture. And with all the buzz around pulse protein and increasing demand for plant protein, pulses are becoming an integral part of agriculture climate change solutions. And whether you agree with this or not, it is the direction we're moving, you know, where they are suggesting that we replace some meat proteins with plant proteins to really help drive climate change solutions. And I found this nice graph on the Western producer that just showed how the demand for alternate proteins has been growing so rapidly in the last really 5 years or so. So lots of interest of increasing pulses in our rotations. I know in Manitoba with the Rocket plant there, you know, we're seeing that happen firsthand with this demand for plant proteins. So let's move on to our, okay, so we know that pulses are really good for agriculture, and so let's move on to what the issues are. And really when we're looking at kind of this, we're looking at this sort of movie scenario of a gang of root robbers. There's always the big bad in any kind of antagonistic situation. And in this case, our big bad is Aphanomyces eutyches. And that's because we can see it do damage like I'm showing you in this picture. I think I show this picture in almost every one of my presentations, just because it's a kind of a perfect example of what Aphanomyces can do. And this was in southern Alberta in a really, really wet year in 2014. And that's really when we see the disease is the worst. And when we look at and pull up some of these roots from these areas here where you can see, you know, no yield at all down here, and we pull up what some of these roots look like, and you can see why I call them root robbers, because really there's no root material left on these under really highly diseased conditions. We get complete loss of the lateral roots, and then the tap roots are completely blackened. In some cases, you'll just pull them up and there's just kind of this stub of little stub of a root, and you just get this little piece of vascular material that's kind of hanging on. And when we look at Aphanomyces, the reason why it's so difficult to manage is because of its life cycle. And so I'll go over that here. Every plant pathologist loves life cycles. And that's because it helps us understand, you know, how to manage these pathogens or maybe what some of its weaknesses are. So Aphanomyces starts out with these oospores that you can see here in the roots. These are very thick-walled resting spores. And here, I think the picture shows really well how thick these cell walls are. And this makes them really, really able to withstand a lot of different environmental extremes. So they can survive in soil for a really long time. And they sit there and wait until we introduce our poor innocent victims, either a pea or a lentil crop. And then there's some sort of host signal that is sent from the peas or lentil to the oospores that tells them to wake up. And then once they sense that signal and there's moisture there, those oospores wake up and they germinate to produce this, which is the multiplier stage of the pathogen. This stage here, which are zoospores. So you get this cluster. Well, one oospore can produce hundreds to thousands of these zoospores. I'm trying to show sort of a cluster here that's starting to, these little zoospores move around. So you can see this cluster is starting to empty as we get zoospores moving around. And they can swim fairly short distances when there's lots of water in the soil, to find those juicy pea roots. They infect the pea, these healthy pea roots. They can kind of colonize the whole pea root very quickly. This whole thing can occur within 7 to 10 days. And here you can see that, you know, they've just eaten up all that juicy part of the pea root. And then the root becomes decayed, uses up all the nutrients, and then it goes back to producing these oospores that get left behind in the soil. So it's really this oospores that makes us so challenging because they can survive in soil for so long. And as I said, root robbers destroy the roots. You know, oftentimes, so we talk a lot about Aphanomyces, but I just like to kind of drive home that this is a complex. So Aphanomyces might be our big bad, but there are lots of different pathogens that are helping it along, sort of its gang members here. And so most often we see roots are infected with a pathogen complex. And it's when they're infected with that complex that we often see roots like that look like this, because you have Aphanomyces possibly coming first, and then all the other things come in and colonize it and really just destroy those roots. So how can we stop this gang of root robbers and give peas a chance to be able to be part of our sustainable agriculture? And this is supposed to be me as the mad scientist, trying whatever I can. I'm very fortunate that I get you know, good support from pulse grower industries to try a lot of these different things because management is so challenging. And because disease plants no longer are providing that nitrogen benefit, you know, this really has an impact to the whole agricultural system. And something that really hasn't been looked at is what that impact of root rot is on the protein content of seeds. You know, if they can no longer fix nitrogen, then how are they making protein in those seeds? So maybe something to look into further. And so when we look at management options, this is the challenge again. There's very, very few management options. Basically, all we have is crop rotation. And within crop rotation, I have it kind of listed as either prevention or avoidance. And I'll get into what those, you know, maybe the subtle differences between those two in the next couple slides. As of right now, we don't really have any genetic resistance deployed into agronomic cultivars. There is some partial resistance, but it's difficult to move into cultivars that are going to perform well agronomically. We don't have any fungicides. There are some seed treatments that are registered for early season suppression, but often we see this disease come in a little bit later in the season, so the seed treatments aren't active past about 4 weeks. So far, any biological controls that we've looked at haven't provided kind of long season control either. They might colonize the seedlings, but they don't seem to persist long term. Then I have a question mark for soil amendments because we are looking at things like liming, but you know, there's questions about the feasibility of being able to amend your soil when you're looking at these large field crops. So when we talk about prevention, really what I'm talking about here is that if you're growing peas or lentils and you don't have root rots yet, then how do you prevent them from developing? And I think that is, you know, kind of, I have it at the bottom there. It might just be luck. So really the best thing we can preach is rotation, rotation, rotation. Don't have these tight rotations. You know, some places in Saskatchewan have been lentil durum for a long time. And that's just going to increase the risk and the speed with which you'll develop a root rot problem. If you practice good rotations, that will delay kind of the pathogen building up in the soil. There was some work done on the frequency of susceptible pulse crops, or pea and lentil in your cropping history, but they haven't really been able to nail down that magic number. And it really seems to depend on what that soil moisture was during your last pea or lentil crop. So if every time you happen to grow a pea, it's a really, really wet year, then you'll likely develop a root rot problem earlier. If you're lucky and it happens to be a dry year every time you grow a pea, then it might take you longer to develop this root rot problem. So there is a lot of research going into this kind of pulse frequency and rotations, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And then so the other scenario when we're looking more at avoidance rather than prevention is, so you do grow peas and you do have root rot. Now what can you do? And really the only recommendation that we have right now is this extended break away from pea and lentil. And again, the big question is how long? And I've intentionally left the rest of this slide blank because it's maybe a question that we don't have an answer to yet. We recommend 6 to 8 years. And I'm doing a lot of research on trying to figure out, okay, well, can we measure your soil and tell you what your risk is? And that's been really challenging to get, really accurate results. And I think with COVID, when we talk so much about this, people are so informed about different kinds of tests, and we talk about PCR tests. That's what we've been trying to develop, is a PCR test to be able to test your soil, but we end up with a lot of false negatives. And again, we've been hearing about false negatives and false positives for a long time, for the past 2 years. So I feel like everyone knows what those mean now, but we're trying to figure out why we get so many false negatives from a lot of our soils. So I'm going to move on for the rest of this presentation and talk about research that we've been doing in the field. So a lot of the field trials. And we've been looking, like I said, sometimes I do feel like I'm the mad scientist because we've been looking at a lot of different things, just throwing on everything out there. Okay, what will maybe provide some management options in the field? So we've been looking at seed treatments. That's been ongoing for about 6 years. And so far I can say nothing's really been stellar. So I'm not going to provide any results on that. We've been looking at rotations, intercrops, and cover crops. I'm going to talk about those 3 projects today. And then we're also just starting to look at liming, so I'm not going to talk about that today. Jumped ahead here. So something that we've been doing is looking at sort of what's the frequency between pulse crops, and can we include an alternate pulse crop in a rotation and not increase disease pressure? So we're looking at just a common rotation with cereal and canola, but then including an alternate pulse crop in there at different locations. So we're doing chickpea and Tabor and Swift Current, fava bean at Lacombe and Saskatoon, and then soybean at Redvers and Morden. Okay, so I'm going to go through just a couple of these locations. Like I said, there is 6 locations. Every location is a little bit different, so I'm going to kind of highlight a few locations, but not spend all the time going through all 6. And for this first slide, I'm just going to walk through what we did here. And so at our Tabor site, this is a producer's field that has a root rot problem that we had identified in 2014. They did grow lentils last at this site in 2016. And so when we look at putting in the peas, we started this project in 2018. So our first year in 2018, we had peas that had been peas in rotation that, so it was a 1-year break, because the last time there was a susceptible host was lentils in 2016. And then in 2018, we just grew, on every other plot, we grew chickpeas as our alternate pulse crop. And then after that, we just started looking at kind of this length of time away from peas. So we had peas in 2018, and then because this one was our 1-year break treatment, we had peas again on the same spot in 2020. And then we look at our disease severity, we measure it in June, and then we measure it again in July. We can see disease severity was very high. We look at our pea yields, they actually did okay, relatively okay for a root rot site in 2018. But look, it was actually quite dry in 2018. So we still get high disease levels, but the yields are better. In 2020, when we had pea kind of on pea after a 1 year break, and it was a very wet year. We can see how poor those peas yielded. And then we move on to the next treatment, and this was a 2 year break. So this is, we had peas in 2019, and intervening we had chickpeas in 2018, and then peas on 2019. And so we can see the disease severity in June was actually quite low, much lower than what we saw for this treatment. But by July, the disease severity had increased. But we actually got pretty good yields this year, and that's because when you look at our moisture, this was really good moisture conditions, not too dry, not too wet. So really happy for, that's what peas like. Then we move on to our 3 year break. So this would have been in 2020. Very high disease, both in June and July, and extremely low yields, even after this 3 year break. And that's because that was that really, really wet year. And what we can see is that having chickpea in that rotation didn't really impact the disease severity. And then we look at these yields, there's actually no significant difference between these two yields. So we can say, well, we can include chickpea in a rotation. It's not going to impact the pea disease severity, but it's also not making it any better. And then at our 4 year break, this was 2021, very dry year. We can see here very little rain. We had fairly high disease severities, and yields really were not that great. Better than we saw in that wet year though. So really what this tells us is that it's going to take a long time for these sites to recover from root rot and start to see yield improvement. And this is just an example of what it looked like under dry conditions in 2021 last year, kind of very spindly pea plants. The canopy really didn't fill out at all. And that's what our roots looked like. Okay, and we move on to Redvers. This site last had peas in 2015. So when we started the trial in 2018, it was already kind of a 2 year break. So we just start counting the time from that time frame on. And then we compared it, so 2018, and then we put peas on that same site 1 year after a 1 year break. And so again, we can see how that affects root rot, very high levels, yields fairly low, and rainfall. Redvers actually was a pretty good rainfall site. It seems to kind of have moderate rain the whole time. We don't get this extreme wet, extreme dry like we did in Tabor. And then when we look at kind of this 3 year break with or without, in this case, we had soybeans as our alternate pulse crop. Again, we can see we got these lower disease levels in June, but by July, the disease severity had really increased. And then interestingly here, we saw quite a nice yield bump from having soybeans in rotation compared to just peas. But this was also kind of the year when we had the best yields in that plot that included soybeans. Because then when we look at the 4 year break, including soybeans, we didn't quite see that same yield bump. So I don't know if you're getting some, the question is, are we getting some sort of transient nutrient bump or nitrogen bump from having a soybean in rotation that then the peas can take advantage of? We have measured the nutrient levels in the soil, but I just don't have all that data here to show you. And then in the 5 year break here in 2021, a bit drier, and we didn't see, again, disease severity is really high, and we're not really seeing those yields improve very much even after a 5 year break. And then the last site that I'm going to show you is Morden. This is actually where Aphanomyces disease nursery. So disease pressure here would be the highest of all the sites. This site has had peas probably for the last 20 years just to maintain that Aphanomyces at really, really high levels. And so what we can see here is that, disease severity very high after these 3 years. We had brutal yields in 2020 when it seemed to be a little bit wetter. And then when it was drier, we actually see the yields kind of come up a little bit, but still, pretty low for peas. So just as kind of a summary here, what we're looking at is a very long road to recovery. And reduction of oospore levels in the soil. With these sites now, we have some that are about a 5 year break, and we're still not seeing any improvement in disease severity or yields. Wet conditions that we experienced in 2020 are more detrimental to yield potential under high disease pressure, but the root rot severity was still high under drought conditions, and you sort of get this confounding factor of, are we seeing reduced yields because of drought that peas don't like, and, combined with this root rot severity. But what we did see from all the sites is that soybean, including soybean, faba bean, or chickpea, didn't seem to impact root rot severity in either direction. So what I'm saying is it didn't make it worse, but it also didn't make it better. So again, I'll move on here to talking about cover and other rotational crops. So what we did here in 2019, we planted just the whole field with different rotational crops, either green manure or seed, planted in highly infested fields in Lethbridge, Lacombe, and Saskatoon. And then some of the crops were used as green manure and they were tilled or not tilled into the soil. And then in 2020, we just planted peas into that whole footprint of the 2019 crops, and then looked at root rot severity, pathogen levels, and yield. And so this is what the site would look like. This is our site in Lethbridge. So you can see just a whole bunch of different kind of crops out on that site. These were either harvested or taken and mowed down and tilled in as green manure. And then in 2020, we planted peas on those footprints. And so what we saw was first that there was no effective tillage. This is a question we get a lot, so it was nice to have this answer. Tillage did not improve disease severity. It was interesting because kind of visually it looked like plots were doing better under tillage, but once we collected everything and did the stats, there really was no effective tillage. And the disease severity was high and uniform in all the treatments at all the sites. Interestingly, what we did see was that in Lacombe in 2020, when we planted peas onto these footprints, we did see a nice significant impact on pea yield under some treatments, and those treatments specifically were the Caliente mustard as a green manure, faba bean as both a green manure or taken to seed, and also oats as a green manure. We only saw this effect in Lacombe, and that's because Lacombe had the best growth of these crops in 2019. It was dry in 2019 in Lethbridge and Saskatoon, so we didn't get great establishment of some of these crops. But Lacombe had much better conditions, so we had really good biomass of these crops. And then when we looked at just crops that we used just as a cover crop, one of these brassica blends here, which was, it's listed down here what was in it, we also saw quite a nice yield boost, almost double what we saw, more than double what we saw over the pea control. So that was really encouraging. We repeated that whole cycle, so these rotational crops were grown again in 2021, and then we're going to plant peas in 2022. The big problem is that 2021 we had a very disappointing establishment of these crops and of getting really good biomass to be able to see an effect because of the drought. This is what our faba beans look like in 2021 in Lethbridge. They're just clobbered by drought and grasshoppers. So I'm not very optimistic that we'll see an effect in 2022 on the pea crops. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the work we've been doing with intercropping with brassicas. We did this at a couple sites, and just to run through it quickly, what we saw at the site in Manitoba that was run by Scott Chalmers was that there was a nice yield boost to the peas whenever they're intercropped with either a canola or a mustard. And if we looked at this sort of land equivalency ratio here, we're seeing every treatment was significantly greater than 1, which means you're getting a really good use of your land by growing 2 crops. There was no effect on disease severity, but for some reason we do see this kind of yield boost to peas. We ran this also at Saskatoon and Tabor, and what was consistent across all 3 sites was that the sort of pea mustard at a 50-50 seeding rate was consistently had high yields of peas in the intercrop and consistently had this significantly higher land equivalency ratio. So we expanded the trials in 2021 to look at more mustards and more locations. And again, the dry year did impact this a little bit, but what we can see again is that the peas in the intercrops sort of outperformed peas in the monocrop in the sense that here, if we're looking at 50% seeding rate, you know, we're getting 83 to 63% more yield of peas compared to the monocrop. But when we look at the land equivalency ratio, we can see that they actually, most of them didn't go over 1. And that's because the brassicas didn't yield well in 2021. because of these dry conditions. And also maybe a mistake is that we didn't fertilize because, you know, we were looking more at pea growth. So we wanted to see how well the peas would do. So I think the brassica suffered because of that. So the next year we'll repeat this, or this year in 2022, and we'll add some fertilizer to support those brassica crops. And then what was interesting is that the oats overgrew the peas, so it didn't really work very well. That's just a summary of basically what I said. 50-50 pea mustard intercrop. The pea yields overperformed the pea monocrop at all the 3 locations, but the pea canola intercrops weren't consistent across the locations. And then in 2021, we did see that the pea and the brassica intercrops yielded better than the monocrops, but the brassicas did not yield well at all. So just gonna kind of leave off here with looking at what pulse crops can you grow if we're looking at including pulse crops that are essential to building sustainable systems. If you have a root rot problem in your field, stay away from pea and lentils. Soybean, faba bean, and chickpeas are good options, recognizing that they are not as adapted across the prairies as peas are. Dry bean has its own root rot issues, and some of the pathogens might be transferable between pea and dry bean, so that's something to watch out for. Alfalfa is a yes or a no. It really depends on the race of Aphanomyces you have in your field. And in Canada, we just don't have that information yet. In the States, alfalfas are rated for Aphanomyces resistance, but they're not in Canada. Vetches, there's lots of interest in vetches and clovers and lupins, you know, as cover crops, or sorry, as vetches and clover and cover crops. Vetches are highly susceptible to Aphanomyces, and clover, it really depends on the species. Lupins, there's some interest in this as a new pulse crop, and they do appear to be resistant to Aphanomyces. So this is where we're moving to with research. You know, trying to develop the soil test at the beginning. I said I've been working on this for a while. Works really well in the black soil zone, so that's good for Manitoba, but it doesn't work that well in the brown and the dark brown soil zones. We're starting to do some work on this ooze spore decay models. So how long does it actually take for these ooze spores to break down in soil? And then there's a lot of work going on into developing resistant cultivars and then agronomics to support those resistant cultivars when they are available. So with that, I just thank all the funders, you know, really big program, lots of people involved. And I just always like to end my presentations with a picture of the mountains to remind us that things are difficult, but we can overcome. And with that, I have time for a couple questions, I think.
Thank you. There are a couple questions here. So with peas just starting to be introduced again, what would your ideal rotation be? There's lots of canola, wheat, soys, edible beans, potatoes in their area.
Yeah, I think, you know, the cereal canola peas is a really good rotation, but it's extending the rotation to not have peas in there too often. So you want to start with, you know, peas maybe every 4 to 5 years if you're just looking at introducing them into your field. Yeah. And dry beans, potatoes, you know, that's maybe a little more difficult. There are some of the fusarium species that are transferable between dry beans and potatoes. So that's something to watch out for.
All right, and our second question, when it comes to intercrop versus crop rotation, what is the long-term profitability?
That's a good question that I don't know if I have the answer to that one. You know, we're just looking at intercrop first to see if there was any benefit to root rot, either improving root rot or at least improving yield. So we haven't looked at any of the economics yet on how that would look. You know, certainly it does look like if you have a root rot field and you do intercrop, your yields might be a little bit better, but I mean, they're still not what you would get in a pea crop without root rot.
And Daryl's asking, what are the prospects for genetic resistance?
There's good, I think there's some good, some good advances being made, particularly through the Crop Development Center, where they have taken some of this partial genetic resistance that was developed in France and the US are being moved into some agronomically adapted lines. I just want to stress that what we're looking at is partial resistance. So you get a reduction in the disease severity, but you don't get elimination of the disease. So when the lines are available as cultivars, they will need to be deployed with caution and, still won't be the best fit for these really highly infested fields because you will still get some disease. And then there is worry that we don't want that resistance to be overcome too quickly. So, on that last slide, when I kind of showed where our integrated management needs to go, deployment of resistant cultivars will really depend on knowing what's in your soil and knowing what your disease, whether you're in like a really high disease pressure field or whether you're in a lower disease pressure field.
All right, thank you so much. I will leave it there for now, and I will hand it over to Dr. Tenuta, and he can start his presentation.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And here we go. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm pleased to be here, give you an update on SCN in Manitoba with some of our research, and some of it's just really fresh. And thanks to Manitoba Pulse and Soy Growers for the invitation to speak to you here. I hope someday we can be out in the field for getting it right out in the field. So SCN, an update. So this is the map of SCN. In red are counties that have been positive for SCN. And you can see there's been quite a march. It starts from the early 1950s, and this goes up to a few years ago, 2017. And you can see the starting points are really down here in the southern US and quickly expanding northward. And initially, when this SCN was founded in North America, there was a thought that it was going to be a southern issue, that it would be too cold in the northern United States for SCN. But of course, this is completely false, and you can see it's in southern Ontario and in Quebec as well. And a big thing here is North Dakota and Minnesota, and you can see they're getting filled in with red. So in effect, what's happening is these red areas are regions where soybean is heavily grown, prominent crop, field crop in United States and in Canada. And so obviously for the past, well, I don't know, it's almost picking up on 10 years now, we've been interested in SCN in Manitoba, and is it going to be established here or not? So that's what this little path here is about. We've done several surveys with the support of MPSGA, and one survey here that was initiated over a few years early on, almost 10 years ago now, well, it started about 10 years ago now, examined 76 soybean commercial fields. We took umpteen number of samples. Some were composited for a field or sections of a field and then processed. And we've been prioritizing commercial fields that are proximity to water courses from the United States that are prone to flooding. Also, the number of soybean years. So we were looking at fields that had at least 3 years in which soybean had been grown on them, and we're more interested in fields that had 5 or more, because we were thinking that they may have be the fields that actually have the establishment of CSN. And then fields that had a history of dry bean. I'll show you why. We looked at including that in our survey in terms of commercial fields. And we sampled field areas. So we split up fields into areas that are more prone to establishment of SEM. And so these are areas that like depression areas, headlands, entrance ways to fields where SEM from other fields could be brought in. Now, in our examination of the soil and pulling out the nematodes, we get some cysts. Now, so this is a juvenile here, a juvenile nematode that would be, looks like, could be soybean cyst nematode. It has this conical tail that we call it. It has a head area here with a stylet or spear right here that you can see looks like a little pin there. And so in our first survey, we would get some nematodes like this. Here's a close-up of that head area. This is the spear here that gets poked into root cells for the nematode to feed. Here's the tail area. And this is the casing in which a whole bunch of nematode eggs would be in. This is actually the remnant of a female, of one female, and she produces eggs, and a lot of the eggs stay inside her. And when she dies, she becomes a tough coating to protect the eggs within. And these cysts can survive in soil for many years. They decline over time if they're not able to hatch and reproduce and produce more cysts on soybean. But it will take years to get rid of them all that have built up in soil. And what I mean by years, well, we're probably talking pushing 10 years to start really knocking them down to somewhere around 10 or 15% of their starting population. So we were able to see cysts from that first survey, and we have round ones, and then there are ones that are not quite round, but more lemon shaped. And so it's the ones that look like this that can possibly be soybean cyst nematode. The round ones are not. Okay, so there's many species of cyst nematodes out there. You may have heard of the potato cyst nematode, which fortunately we do not have here on the prairies. And so it looks more like a round one here. But there are also native cyst nematodes that are just present here that would have been with the original vegetation in Manitoba. And so, and they're still here. So having these cysts, even finding what looks like a cyst nematode, a soybean cyst nematode, isn't confirmation that we actually have soybean cyst nematode. Our confirmation results use molecular techniques. And when we examined all the cysts and eggs and juveniles that we recovered, which wasn't very much, just a handful of cysts from all those umpteen number of soil samples, we were able to say we could not find proof of having the species soybean cyst nematode present in Manitoba. This is just an example here, photograph of how we recover the cysts from soil samples. This is recovering cysts from soil samples where we're surveying for soybean cyst nematode. So we're expecting the levels to be very low of the nematode. And we use 2 pounds of soil into a big canister. We flood that soil with water. The cysts, if they're present, will float in the water, spill over through the spout onto a stack of sieves and be retained on the stack of sieves. And then we can either laboriously, tediously, my poor students will, under a microscope, look for the cysts, or as we're doing more so now, we're jumping straight to taking this debris and crushing it to liberate the eggs and juveniles. And then underneath a microscope, we need to count how many eggs and juveniles, and by juveniles, I mean those worm-like nematodes that are soybean cyst looking. It's very laborious, but it's an excellent method to really get a good handle, accurate handle on the levels of soybean cyst nematode in soil. So here's some of that confirmation work where we're using species-specific primers, so PCR primers. Everybody seems to know about PCR now because of COVID, unfortunately. And really what we're looking for is a band that would show up in this position. And we don't have that. This is a positive control. So this is soybean cyst nematode that we got from Ontario. And our cyst nematodes from Manitoba at that time showed to be negative. So that's how we came to the conclusion that there was not soybean cyst nematode in any of those samples that we had found. We did a follow-up survey then and starting in 2017, where Nazanin, a PhD student working on this project with SCN, sampled 30 soybean fields, commercial fields. These are new soybean fields that we hadn't sampled before. And here you can see the location of those really around the Red River Valley, close to the American border. And this oddity out here by St. Claude that they're suspect of having a soybean field based on some work that CFIA had done years back, saying that there seemed to be cyst nematodes in a sample from a field survey for a different issue, actually for potato cyst nematode survey. Now, what did we find? Again, we found a few cysts, 1, 2, 4, 14 per kilogram of soil in 4 fields, 4 commercial fields. We did the PCR test by using by 2 different genes. One gene from that was available in the published literature, and one that new gene that we've developed in the laboratory to scout or screen for SCN. We've done sequencing of target regions of the DNA of the soybean cyst nematode, and we looked at the morphology of how the cysts look and the juveniles as well, so that we can back up the information from the PCR test that, yeah, these are soybean cyst nematode present. We found 4 fields that were positive for soybean cyst nematode, and one of them had the most cysts, and that's the one here with 14 cysts per kilogram of soil. This is really low level, by the way. And we scouted that field. It wasn't soybean. It was in the RM of Norfolk treehorn, and we were looking for roots. The first time Nazanin went out there, she couldn't find them on the roots. The second time, after spending the whole day out there, she found this, and that is a soybean cyst nematode from a root in that field. So we were able to see, at least anyway, one, if not just a couple of cysts on a soybean roots in that one field. So the conclusion of that survey was 4 RMs positive for soybean cyst nematode in low levels. And as you can see here, they are 3 of them right by the American border, US border. And there's that Norfolk treehorn that was a suspect field, and it was indeed positive for soybean cyst nematode. This kind of makes sense when I was showing you the image of the march northward, right, of soybean cyst nematode. And we expect it to be coming up through the Red River Valley. Now, that could be because some of this area here is older land in soybean. Could also be because of the Red River itself bringing the nematode up, and then with flooding, bringing cysts from the US land into the water, then onto our land via the water. It could be from birds, could be a few things that we'll talk about. And in gray were the RMs that we sampled that were negative. So as of 2019, we're positive for soybean cyst nematode in Manitoba. Now, something really interesting happened last year. So an agronomist working with a grower saw this at the edge of a field, and dwarfed, stunted chlorotic soybean at the edge of the field, is kind of considered as a headland, but this area is actually planted right up to the edge of that roadway. And the agronomist was a good agronomist and suspected that, went through all the typical troubleshooting process to figure out what's going on here, and narrowed it down to that could be soybean cyst nematode. We went out, Dennis Lang and I, Cassandra as well, and we were at this field and took soil samples. We also looked at the roots. And so here's the soybean stem there, and you can see these little white specks there. I'm just gonna take a check. Can you still hear me, everyone?
Yep.
Excellent. The little white specks here are soybean cyst nematodes. They're white because the female is growing, but she's not mature. She hasn't died yet. She's still producing eggs and packing them in her. She can release some of them into the soil while she's growing there. And this, again, was late June. Okay, and you can see them there. I have to keep stopping myself saying, oh, what a beautiful picture. It's not a beautiful picture. It's not a beautiful picture because it is, this is the beginning of bad news in terms of yield reduction and extra management for a producer. Deal with potential decline in yield. Now, these cysts are way smaller than a nodule, and the nodules are there's there. And let me stop this thing. Okay, that's not a good spot. Some nodules there. There's a nodule there. Much bigger than these little white cysts here, and they're lemon shaped. Okay, this is a great soil. It's nice and light textured soil, and we can pull out the roots and dislodge the soil very easily from them, and the cysts didn't fall off the soil. So it was actually a very good soil to be scouting with. More close-ups here. You can see the chlorosis and the stunting of the plants. Here is where we washed off the roots, and you can really see the cysts on those soybean plants. This is in the field. We grew in the lab now soybean with soil from that field. And the area are here's Naz washing off the little root cone of soybean, and there she can see cysts on the roots. And so again, we have confirmation in the laboratory greenhouse of establishing soybean cyst nematode from this soil. So it's very much, so it's kind of tail end of what we do in plant pathology to prove that we have a disease in terms of see if we can establish it on plants that we grow in the greenhouse. Now this is the field, and this was the area that was intensively sampled for that we did a follow-up. This was the area that was diseased. And we went back in September. So if you recall, last year it was dry, and then we got a little bit of rain at the beginning of September. And what do you see here? We have a maturing field here of soybean that was not affected previously in June by the soybean cyst nematode. And that area that was affected has now started to grow. Lots of weeds though, but starting to grow. And this happens with soybean cyst nematode. It really has delayed the growth of the soybean, and once the conditions improve, in this case more moisture, they were able to become healthier and start to grow. And so this is a classic sign of what SCN can do, in that the symptoms and the damage and reduction in yield is greatest under drought conditions or dry years. So it's classic why we saw this patch area, and even in this case, the rebound is not rebounding enough to yield for this producer, of course. But you can really see the mess here that the soybean cyst nematode has caused, particularly in terms of the weeds. And here's Nazanin sampling the soil, because we did an intensive grid sampling of this patch. And so here's the patch there, the rectangle, and we sampled in a rectangle. And these are the analyses here of eggs of SCN per 100 milliliters of soil. And you can see that the highest levels are just in from the road by about 6 meters, and in the center of what we saw visually as a really horrible patch succumbing to SCN. So really good confirmation that, yeah, what we saw out there was definitely due to SCN, and the severity is highest in the center of that patch and then declines when we get to the green areas and nice growing areas. Back in June, there was no soybean cyst nematode. So what's probably going to happen in this field is that patch is going to grow, and the SCN levels are going to start to move into the field and along that roadway edge here. Okay, so in whatever 5-10 years from now, this patch is going to be bigger in a drought year. Okay, and it's going to provide less, more and more yield reduction. We took the nematode from that field, for the soybean cyst nematode from that field. We sent the nematode down to the United States, to the University of Missouri, and they did what's referred to as an HG typing or race test. Okay, and we just nowadays we call it just HG type. And it's basically taking that population and growing it on different resistance lines of SCN resistance in soybean. And so basically kind of think of these as indicator breeding lines of soybean cyst nematode with different resistance genes to SCN. And the number that you see here in terms of percent, if it's above 0, that means our population in Manitoba could reproduce on this indicator line. So with this one, PI 88788, there was a 4.2% increase in population of the nematode from what we added or started with on this plant line. And anytime it gets above 10%, we call that a significant reproduction or growth of the nematode on that line. And we say the resistance this line is not resistant to our population. And that's the case here with cloud, with indicator line 7, 14.6%. Okay, so we had 3 indicator lines that we had reproduction on, and one in particular, the cloud or line 7, and we had more than 10%. So the conclusion is we have an HG type 7 population in that Manitoba field. In the old system, that's equivalent to a race 3. Okay, now what's really important about this is tells us something about where we're going with SCN, because where there is reproduction on cloud and then lower reproduction on PI 88788. This is the beginning where we know in time this population will become more and more resistant to the dominant SCN resistant lines and soybean varieties available right now. Okay, so again, we have basically, think of it as the beginning of resistance of SCN to the dominant resistant lines of the genetics for SCN that you can get from your seed suppliers. In time, this is probably going to increase above 10%, and then higher and higher if we do the same trend that has happened in Minnesota, North Dakota, and other places, and there's no reason why it would not happen here too. Here in North Dakota are the HG types, and you can see this area here is where there's the highest amount of SCN, and this is the oldest area of establishment of SCN and soybean grown in North Dakota, so that makes sense that it's here. And you can see that they all have 7. They all have 7, so it means more than 10% growth on the indicator line 7, and a lot have 2s. So more, that's the Peking line, indicator line 2, and that is the line that is the majority of resistance genes that are in the seeds you can buy that are resistant to SCN. So in other words, they're already having resistance breakdown in North Dakota, okay? Now, if we look at the seed guide for Manitoba, there is a column that will tell you if a variety is SCN susceptible or not, okay? Again, these lines are going to be, vast majority are going to be from this genetics here. And we're already starting to see the breakdown of that, okay? But it's still low in terms of reproduction at the moment. In time, though, as evolution continues, become more and more prevalent. So using resistance lines that are available to you will be effective, okay? In time, though, and I can't tell you when, 5, 10, 15 years, it's going to be much less, though, in terms of resistant to SCN. So this is the current map of SCN, including the RM of Thompson, where that last find last year was. And this is now an updated North American map with Manitoba included, and you can see here. So we're starting to fill in, again, as soybean area expands, SCN follows. Now, SCN, emerging disease issues, dry beans, and I bring this out because we grow dry beans here. And dark red kidney field in 2016 was heavily stunted in Minnesota, the commercial field, and it found out that stunting was due to SCN. So this is an issue because if you grow dry beans and you're growing soybean cyst nematode, you're going to need to be careful because you can have problems with your dry beans, and also because the dry beans are a host, you can be ramping your population up. So you never rotate a soybean in dry bean fields. Another issue is this, and that's SCN is the gateway for sudden death syndrome caused by Fusarium. And this is a big issue in Ontario. My brother provided this slide. And so soon after SCN came in, sudden death is a problem. Same as case in Minnesota, North and South Dakota. Okay, so this is just potentially the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to have to now start being vigilant for sudden death. And by managing SCN, we go a long way to managing sudden death because, like I said, it's the gateway. Okay, so many things to do to potentially manage SCN and slow down its buildup. One of them is testing soils for SCN, growing non-host crops, okay, so corn, wheat, small grains, using SCN resistant genetics and lines, okay, and in some cases there are nematode protectant seed treatments, and we don't need to go here at the moment in Manitoba, I think. And then, although I'd like to be looking at this to be prepped and prepared for the years to come. And we're not sure about cover crops. Some cases they can even exacerbate issues with SCN in some cases, but it's not really known yet. Now, what does it look like? These are fields here in Ontario. These dwarfed areas, yellow, stunted areas. And this can be looking like a nitrogen issue or iron chlorosis, so nitrogen in terms of low nitrogen levels from a depression area, whether it be waterlogged, okay? So iron or nitrogen deficiency, they could look like it was an SCN issue. So you gotta be careful. You gotta really pull out those roots. More example of being confused with drown out areas. Iron chlorosis areas. Avoid host plants. So these are all hosts for soybean cyst nematode. And many are weeds, and some of the ones that I think are common in our area I put here, and some of them are crops. Here's the dries, even field pea to some extent, and then obviously soybean. Okay, so we need to be careful. Weed management goes a long way, and be careful with our rotations. Lengthen out the soybean rotation. Don't mix soy and dries, and use resistant varieties. Now, areas of fields to watch out for are headlands, depressions, fence rows, entranceways, sloughs. These are where the nematode can be brought in on tractors, on implements, through in water onto fields. Prevent movement of soil between fields. In lighter textured soils, you can use a air compressor to blow off the soil or a pressure washer to knock off the soil. I know it's difficult. Walking on fields, keep pickups off fields because we can transfer the nematode through the soil. Now, birds are an issue because the cyst can be on birds' feathers and feet and so forth, also in the wind and so forth. Moving around, these cysts are very light. Okay, so I don't really, if you're a hunter, you might be doing yourself a favor. Now, also here we use resistant varieties. Can you spot where there's not resistant varieties? Right there and there, of course. Okay, and they're succumbing to soybean cyst nematode. This is from my brother in Ontario. So make a big difference. At one time, you would take a yield hit by using resistant lines. But now they've bred that out and they yield just as good as the non-resistant lines. Scout. Okay. Scout your fields. You've had three years or more of soybean. 30 to 45 days after emergence. Use a spade, easier to do on lighter textured soil. If you have a heavy soil, use a bucket, dunk the roots in gently. Be careful not to strip off the cysts from the roots, okay? And you can keep scouting up to 21, 28 days before harvest, okay? But as you get older, the cysts become darker and darker. And so they become less easy to spot. Really, this 30 to 45 days is the nice magic sweet spot, okay? You can send samples or contact your MARD rep. You can contact Dennis. You can contact me directly if you suspect you have a big issue in a field with that dwarfing. Okay, also Agvise provides a service for testing of soils too. And they're just, I think you all know how to dig roots out of soil, but just be very gentle and careful. Okay. With that, lots of people to thank the pulse and soy growers and all the grower members to supporting this research. We are currently, we took that field from 2021 and we blitzed it on a grid basis, the whole field for sampling, and we're just now counting the eggs that are present there. So in a week or two, we're actually going to have great information on that whole field and know if there's more patches in that field to help that producer, and also just to understand the growth and how rapid the nematode is going to expand in that field. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tenuta. We've got one question. Are there alternate hosts for SCN?
Yes. So there's the one slide I showed where we have the dry edible beans, field pea to an extent, not great, and then a lot of weeds. So from a crop rotation basis, it's pretty easy to stay away from dry edibles and pea with soybean, and then have good weed control.
All right, thank you very much. And
You're welcome.
We'll turn it over to Laura now to finish up our morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry, my computer had a little bit of a hiccup there and kind of freaked out. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm covering off some of our on-farm network hot topics. So these are some trials that we either have a lot of research results for so far, or are just getting a lot of questions on. So I kind of want to talk about them a little bit more. My name is Laura Schmidt. I am the agronomist for the western half of Manitoba, and let's dive into it. So quick overview: soybean seeding rates and improving survivability, and the number of plants that establish in the field, soybean row spacings, pea seeding rates, and then some dry bean nitrogen nutrition to wrap it all up are some of those topics I kind of want to touch on today. Like Daryl mentioned at the very start of our meeting this morning, MPSG has been running on-farm trials since 2012. So we've been at on-farm research for about 10 years now, and you can really see how that program has expanded each year in this animated map showing our yearly trial locations. So this network is fully funded and directed by Manitoba pulse and soybean farmers. So it really is a by farmers for farmers research program. And the goal here is to test new products and practices for production in a way that empowers our farmers to conduct straightforward and reliable research on their farms. So far, we've already had more than 400 trials across Manitoba. And these are kind of the range of trial types or questions we've investigated over those 10 years. So some are one-off farmer questions, while many are building larger data sets. So there is everything from plant establishment type questions to those in-crop decisions. And an example of that larger data set is soybean seeding rate, which has had 100 trials as of last year. So today I'm going to cover off those as well as some dry bean nitrogen nutrition. And I would like to apologize for my dog who is just cruising around the house back there, if you can hear his little clicky clackers. Starting with soybean seeding rates. So we have small plot research that is telling us to target 140 to 160,000 live plants per acre to maximize yield in Manitoba. So that's what we're starting with when we're targeting that plant stand. And from there, we're going to adjust our seeding rate to account for germination and survivability. And that's going to bring us to the actual plant stand we get in our field, which we'll measure using plant counts. So from what we actually achieve in the field, we can then circle back to inform future seeding rate decisions. And investigating seeding rate in on-farm trials, that's how we get statistically sound results on this yield outcome bullet and some of these other factors. So before I get into those trials, the first small plot research study in Manitoba across the province, it was in Melita to Beausejour, Roblin to Arberg, and research stations in between, calculating yield across row spacing sites and years as a percent of the maximum yield at each site, which is shown as relative yield on the side here, and measured plant stands. So from where this data is plateauing, that's where we get that recommendation to target 140 to 160,000 live plants per acre that's highlighted in purple here. A second research study took place in 2014 and 2015. This one also investigated different planting dates, which is why we have these two different groupings of data. And our target is again highlighted in purple here. So here we've got yield plateauing. The top grouping of beans is that May seeding date. And here we have yield kind of plateauing a little bit later. And accounting for pricing, they determine the economic seeding rate to be 195,000 seeds per acre. That second grouping was June seeding dates, which kind of has lower yield potential to begin with. So yield plateaus quite a bit earlier. There isn't any advantage for putting more seeds in the ground when planting later. And here that economic optimum was 125,000 seeds per acre. So those small plot kind of background trials, that brings us to testing seeding rates on farmers' fields with the on-farm network. And the main purpose here is, of course, to assess its effect on yield. And if there is that yield response, is it enough to pay for the increase in seed cost? So what are those impacts of lowering seeding rate? Will it affect yield? Is the big question. And we have tested a range of seeding rate combinations, and they're going to depend based on what each farmer participant is interested in. But the minimum requirement is a difference of at least 30,000 seeds per acre between seeding rate treatments within each trial. And we use that 30,000 to make sure that treatments are different enough from one another that there's potential for difference in both agronomic performance and yield. So we've had 100 seeding rate trials over the last 10 years, which we're showing in this static map. There have been 18 statistically significant yield responses, which are showed in orange. And of those, 12 of them were also economical, meaning the increase in yield paid for that extra seed cost. And those are the triangles on the map. So there also has been a really even distribution of trials per year. So we are capturing a pretty wide range of environments with this data set. So highlighted here, years with more than 10 trials were 2012, 14, 18, 20, and 2021. And since it is 100 trials, the math is a bit of a gimme, but what we're finding with these trials is that seeding rate is really only resulting in a statistically significant yield response less than 1/5 of the time. When we do have that significant response, it more often than not is economical, but 82% of the time, the majority of the time, changing up our seeding rate really hasn't impacted soybean yield with these trials. And I would like to explore that a bit more. So this graph is showing yield by our plant stands during vegetative development. So these are our early season plant counts for each seeding rate treatment at each trial by yield. So the treatments were those seeding rates, but different fields and seeding conditions resulted in different living plant stands. So while the general trend from this data is that as plant standing increased, yield grew, but ultimately from the spread of this data, you can really tell that environment in different fields and years is playing a bigger role than seeding rate in determining yield. And it's also showing us that the outcome of that seeding rate is very field and farm specific. So with that, I would like to also dive into some soybean survivability and plant establishment type topics. But first, here we have our different seeding rates along the bottom, and then the actual plant stands that occurred in the field at vegetative growth stages in this graph and reproductive growth stages here. So for example, you had a seeding rate of 130, and that achieved just over 110,000 plants per acre in the field on average in these trials. So these orange lines are our most common comparison, which is 130, 160, and 190 seeding rates. So for, again, example, this 190,000 seeding rate produced 150,000 live plants per acre at vegetative growth stages. So there is a lot of spread here for what plant stands actually came about as a result of these different seeding rates. And you can kind of see that right here in that spread. But on average, during those V stages early in the season, across seeding rates, 81% of the seed we put in the ground survived to produce a living plant. So this meant that a seeding rate of 175,000 would have been required to reach that minimum 140,000 live plants per acre during V stages. By R stages, that number was reduced to 76%. So we were losing an average of 5% of plants over the growing season. So to get that same 140,000 live plants per acre, 190,000 seeds per acre were necessary. So one question that kind of brings me into talking a little bit more about how we can improve the amount of plants that survive from the seed we put in the ground. And one question that often comes to mind regarding soybean and pulse survivability is going to be equipment damage. So air seeders are expected to be a bit tougher on seed. And in our trials so far, we've had 61 that have used a seeder and 39 that have used a planter. On average, we've seen about 82% survivability with a planter and 80% survivability with an air seeder. So that gap between the two isn't as great as we previously thought, but within this data, again, there is quite the range. So previously, MPSG funded a study with PAMI to investigate what we could do to minimize damage using an air seeder while maintaining seed distribution across the drill. So they looked at a 60-foot Bourgault and a 60-foot John Deere air seeder using 3 different soybean moisture contents and 3 different fan speeds. And here are those results really quickly. Soybean seed moisture content mattered the most, where dry seed suffered more seed coat damage and on average had lower germination than good moisture seed. Fan speed, on the other hand, it didn't have an effect at all using the John Deere air seeder, but lower fan speeds with the Bourgault trials resulted in greater germination. Overall, generally, a combination of higher moisture seed and lower fan speeds is going to be good practice to maximize germination rates in soybeans. Another factor that might go overlooked, but I found has played a really big role in soybean survivability in the last few years is seeding depth. So the Soybean and Agronomy Lab, that's that agronomist in residence program that Daryl was talking about at the U of M, investigated seed depths of 1/4 inch to 2 1/4 inch depths into drier than normal soil over 3 years. So here are the average plant stands for each depth treatment. So everything was seeded at 200,000 seeds per acre, but there was a pretty wide range in the actual plant stands that established in the field depending on those depths. So seeding too shallow had the largest impact on plant stand, where seeds dried out before they could even germinate fully. And seeding too deep, as has been really common these last couple of years, chasing moisture, it really stressed out seedlings and limited productivity coming out of the ground. So they found that there really wasn't any benefit to chasing that moisture past a certain depth. So the optimal range was to target 3/4 of an inch to 1 3/4 inches to maximize yield, as well as plant stand. So variability in the field will play a factor here, as well as variability across the drill, but the best bet would be to minimize what you can, because how stressed those seedlings are coming out of the ground is going to play into how much more stress they can actually handle early in the season. Seeding date is another factor that I just want to cover, and it's going to impact how many plants are making it out of the ground. So the Agronomy Lab also investigated seeding window at 4 sites across 3 years, looking at 4 seeding windows. So we have very early window, early, kind of normal, and then late, which is occurring after our seeding deadline for a lot of areas. And this graph is showing yield at those 4 seeding windows. And late seeding generally reduced yield by about 15%. So this isn't very surprising. We saw that with the earlier seeding date research in 2015 that I started with, but also here, that early seeding window was quite risky in the study. There were late spring frosts in 2 years, and soil temperatures during this window were quite low. The main thing I also wanted to pluck out here is that seeding into cold soils resulted in lower plant stands of 4 out of 11 site years in this study. And that's something that we should keep in mind when we're planning to put soybeans in. But just generally choosing a seeding date to maximize the number of plants coming out of the ground comes down to targeting the 2nd or 3rd weeks of May, within 2 weeks of your region's last spring frost date, seeding into those warmer soils, avoiding cold rains 24 hours afterwards, and making all of that fit into and around your other crops that need to go into May. So there are a lot of other factors that will go into plant establishment, but those are some of the research updates that I just wanted to make sure we're getting out there regarding soybean plant stand establishment. So getting back into some of those soybean seeding rate on-farm trials, I wanted to break down our 2 3-way seeding rate comparisons in a bit more detail. So this is our most frequent 3-way comparison, 130 versus 160 versus 190. You can see from the number of trials here how often we've compared those numbers. And then the second most frequent is 150 versus 180 versus 210, another common one. So our cost of crop production is telling us to assume a unit price of about $68. So each 30,000 seed change between these seeding rates is a difference of $14.55 an acre. So at a soybean sell price of about $12 a bushel, we'd need to see a yield increase of more than 1.2 bushels per acre to justify that change in seeding rate. At soybean prices closer to $14.50 or more, we're going to need less than a bushel. So average early season plant stands and percent survivability from that seeding rate. At higher seeding rates, a greater proportion of the seed did not establish. And then when we look later in the season at average late season plant stand and percent survivability at those potting stages, we see that the margin of plants lost from B to R stages is also higher at greater plant stands or greater seeding rates. So the general trend with yield was that as seeding rate increases, yield does as well. But we need to use statistics to tell us if those yield results are actually a result of the seeding rate and how often that's actually occurring. So here we've got our comparisons of 130 versus 190, which had a significant yield advantage about 1/5 of the time towards where that 190 had a benefit over the 130. And on average, that was increasing yield by just by 2 bushels an acre. When comparing 160 to 190, it was a much less frequent yield response and a smaller yield response. Quite similarly, when we look at 150 versus 180, again, about 1/5 of the time are we seeing a yield response, just over a bushel. And then comparing the two higher seeding rates, a low frequency of response and a less than a bushel per acre difference. So at a $12 bushel sell price, these ones become economical and these ones are not comparatively. But at $16 a bushel, with the way prices have been going, everything but 210,000 per seeds became economical based on the yield differences we saw between treatments. So answering the question of soybean seeding rate, what is my economical choice? Things might be a little bit up in the air this year because results so far are indicating that there is a lot of variability farm to farm and even field to field in the results of different seeding rates and what plant stand establishes. So we've got a large spread between those two factors. So a seeding rate decision made on your farm should really include your own observations. Be sure to take plant counts and compare that back to your seeding rate so you can fully kind of adjust those on for your own farm. But our general economic summary so far is that seeding above 200,000 seeds per acre hasn't provided a consistent return on investment and has had a low frequency of yield response. Seeding at 190,000 had benefits over 130, but not often over 160. So overall, there's been a lower likelihood of yield response, but when it does occur, it's often been economical. And what we're kind of generalizing from a really large data set here is that the general understanding so far has been that a seeding rate of 150 to 180,000 seed per acre has maintained yield most of the time. But dropping below 150,000 seeds per acre might not have shown a significant yield penalty, but it is introducing a lot more risk. So the rest of our crop management just needs to be excellent to maximize yield potential once stands are dropping that low. Which kind of the end of seeding rate. Let's get into row spacing. So the last thing I wanted to pull out of that soybean seeding rate discussion is the question of row spacing. So our seeding rate trials have had many different row widths in them. So we've had 51 that have used narrow rows, 32 using intermediate 15 to 20 inches, and 16 that are used wider rows. And we are seeing just a general trend of higher yields with those narrower rows. But now we have 3 years of row spacing trials from our on-farm network. So let's talk a little bit more about than just observations from these trials. But before getting into the on-farm trials, we got to cover that small plot research in Manitoba, investigating narrow versus intermediate / wide row is what I would call that 16 to 30 inch spread. So here along the bottom, we've got our plant stand counts for each site in each year. The narrow rows are in dark blue and then wide rows in light blue. Stars are indicating, or arrows are indicating sites that have significantly different plant stands between row widths. So here, 50% of the time, plant stands were actually lower with wider row spacings. So the thought was just having more plants within the row led to reduced emergence and some plant-to-plant competition. But how did that look for yield? At sites comparing 10 inches to 27 inches or wider, yield was increased 86% of the time. At sites comparing narrow rows to more intermediate rows of 16 to 14 inches, there was no yield difference 85% of the time. So yield increases in these trials ranging anywhere from 1.5 to 11.6 bushels per acre. And that's the background that brings us to these on-farm trials. How does this compare at the field scale? So in our on-farm trials, we've compared row spacing differences that are more available to farmers without changing up equipment too much on farm. So over the last 3 years, hosted 16 trials. 7 have compared narrow rows of 7.5 to 10 inches versus versus intermediate rows of 15 to 20 inches. And then 9 have tested intermediate 15s to wide 30s. First question I had, though, after looking at those small plot results was at the field scales, are we seeing lower plant stands with wider row spacings? So each trial is using the farmer's typical seeding rate, and each farm is using a different seeding rate. So for these trials, I've calculated survivability again, which is the percent of plants that established from the seeding rate. So here along the bottom of the graph are the number of trials of each comparison. So we have this data for emergence at V stages, as well as later in the season at R stages. And what we're seeing for both is that wide rows have had a disadvantage. So on average, survivability during both stages was 5% lower in 30-inch rows than the 15-inch row spacings. And this occurred at 7 out of 9 trials where 15 versus 30s were compared. So looking beneath the canopy, you can really see how much more clustered plants are within the row with 30-inch rows. And the thought is just that there might be some extra plant-to-plant competition in these wide rows. This leads to more shade or neighbor avoidance characteristics like thinner stems, less branches, as plants are trying to grow to avoid each other. The hope is that this would mean higher lowest pod heights, but that's not always the case. It's more environment dependent. And we can more accurately compare how much sunlight's being captured by different row widths by taking canopy closure measurements in the field. And here's that data for 2020 as well as 2021. Along the bottom are the different row widths, and then the different lines are canopy closure at flowering, potting, and then at R5. So in 2021, plants were quite small and stunted as a result of dry conditions, and that's really showing up in these canopy measurements. They're really low across the board, and on average, those 30-inch rows never fully closed. If we compare that to 2020, this is more what we'd expect to see with different row widths and canopy closure throughout the season. But lack of row closure this year was even showing up in the aerial imagery. You can see the 30-inch rows with the NDVI pretty clearly. But what does that all mean for yield? So we had 7 trials comparing a narrow 7.5 to 10 inches to intermediate rows over here, and then the 9 intermediate versus wide row trials over here. At the narrow versus intermediate, we've had 3 significant yield responses, and comparing 15s to 30s, there have been 2 yield responses. So what does that kind of mean? 43% of the time when comparing narrow versus intermediate rows, we saw just under a 2 bushel an acre increase. And comparing intermediate versus wide, about 1/5 of the time, we saw just over a 2 bushel per acre increase using 15-inch rows over 30 inches. So we can't really quantify the economics of these trials more broadly, since how you'd achieve changes in row spacings will very much vary with your farm and equipment available to you. So shifting gears into peas quickly to talk about pea seeding rates. So small plot trials were set up a few years ago to verify seeding rates in peas. So we had previous recommendations that were telling us to target 7 to 9 living plants per square foot in peas here in Manitoba. And that's something we wanted to test out with newer varieties and at sites closer to home. So in these trials, nice and simple, yield was maximized at 7 to 9 plants per square foot across site years. And that's really verifying that previous recommendation here in Manitoba. So we've got those verified recommendations telling us our optimal living plant stand. I wish that meant the story was over, but there's more going on. So something we noticed as we were doing plant counts in our fungicide trials over the last few seasons were that pea plant stands were kind of all over the place. So this graph is showing plant stands at R3 versus yield for all of those fungicide trials. And they were almost never up to that recommended range of 7 to 9 plants per square foot, but we are seeing some good yields here And this is raising some questions for us. Are we leaving yield behind? Why are these stands so low to begin with? So in part, we are just seeing lower seeding rates in some cases, but across the board, we're on average only seeing 60% of the seed put in the ground becoming a reproductive plant at R3 and surviving. So overall, these questions are what really drove our interest into initiating pea seeding rate trials last year. And 6 trials were started. However, only 4 were able to be harvested. So here, seeding rate treatments vary by 20 seeds per meter squared, which is a difference of about 80,000 seeds per acre. In terms of bushel per acre seeding rate, it's not as simple to summarize since that's going to vary with your seed weight. In 2021, there were no significant yield differences in these trials. Yield was largely driven by moisture and environment last year, but percent establishment or survivability ranged anywhere from 50 to 72% in these trials and averaged 63 across them all. So that's actually pretty consistent with what we were seeing with plant stands in fungicide trials previously. Comparing plant stand to yield for the trials that we do have data for, it is a very small subset of data to start with. So I'm really excited to see these trials continue and watch this data set grow. But from those different seeding rates and different plant stands, we're really not seeing much change in yield last year. In the field, you could visually see how much more vigorous plant growth was at that higher seeding rate. The peas have knit together really well. This is probably going to impact standability later in the season. So just a quick aside, one of the first reasons I think we might not be hitting those plant stand targets, I mentioned how seeding rate treatments when shown in bushels per acre was accounting for different seed sizes. So pea seed size varies quite a bit, and percent germination is going to be something to watch for this spring. So take the time to actually calculate your seeding rate for your peas. So for example, in this table below, targeting 7 or 8 plants per square foot with 95% germination, 90% survivability. These are the range of seeding rates in bushels per acre you'd need for these different seed sizes. So for example, if you're growing a barth peas, they're on average 280 grams per 1,000 seeds. So they'd be over here. Carvers and chromes, on the other hand, would kind of fall right in the middle. But kind of the point I'm trying to make here is that that old rule of thumb, 3 bushel per acre seeding rate, is really only working for smaller seeds at the low end of this plant stand spectrum we're trying to achieve. So take the time, use this equation we've got here, using your own variety's 1,000 seed weight and your farm's expected seed survival to really try and hit those target plant stands. Looking a little bit more into how the plant stand did progress through the season in those on-farm trials, seed was sent out for germination testing, which is the second column. And then based on plant counts, again, survivability at V stages, as well as reproductive stages in the end. So on top of what we expected to lose based on germination, we saw about a 12 to 20% that didn't emerge successfully. And then as the crop progressed into R stages, on average, we saw a loss of another 4% of plants. So if we just take a little closer look at this pea seeding rate trial near Roland, based on this 89% germination rate, in a perfect world, we would have achieved the plant stands that are shown in these blue bars for these different seeding rates. The orange bars are what actually made it out of the ground during V stages. And then the gray bars are what made it to the end of the season. So we've got some pretty big gaps between what we might have expected from germination, what's actually coming out of the ground. And again, there's going to be a lot of factors that come into play here. At that lower seeding rate, though, we've also got more mortality in the seeding during the season. And this happened at a couple other trials too. That's a little bit more risky. So we might not have seen yield differences in these trials, but in stressful years, just how many more plants can you afford to lose? Very similar to the soybean seeding rate messaging. The rest of your management just needs to be excellent. So I mentioned earlier that we were only seeing 60% survivability on average across pea on-farm trials. So similar to soybeans, we also funded a study with Tammy to measure seed damage with air seeders on peas last year. So the original scope of this trial was quite a bit broader, but there were some logistical constraints. So this is what we got. Using a 65-foot forego, 3 pea seed moisture contents, as well as 3 fan speeds, again, were investigated. And really interesting here, fan speed did not affect germination, vigor, or seed coat damage for peas in this trial. And similar to soybeans, seed moisture content did manage matter the most, where germination and vigor were reduced by about 12% each with drier seed. So this year, especially with dry seed and lower germ rates on average, gentle seed handling is going to be key to maintain germination for peas. So if it's possible, use a conveyor, and if it's not, and you're using an auger, be sure to run it slow and full, just to minimize what you can. What are some other things we can do to improve establishment? Just briefly, starting with depth. Oops, went too far. Starting with depth, target 1.5 or 2 inches into moisture. So those pea cotyledons are staying below ground so they can come up from a depth much easier than soybeans. And that into moisture part is key. Do seed in April or early May into soils that have reached 5 degrees at a depth. Warmer soils do mean faster, more even emergence, but delaying seeding too much will also mean peas flower in the heat of summer, and that's going to reduce yield potential from flower blasting. Peas do respond to some starter FOS, but yield increases have not always been large. So do note this maximum safe seed placed phosphorus rate for peas. And then seed treatment. So this is something I'd like to investigate a bit more with on-farm trials. So fungicide seed treatment is likely to pay under wet, challenging spring conditions or on soils with a known history of root rots. And Syama kind of mentioned there is a seed treatment for Aphanomyces, but it will only provide protection for those early season growth stages. So it's really not a complete solution. And one newer pest to Manitoba are pea leaf weevils. So their range has really expanded in the province, but we need more information on their population levels. So pea leaf weevils are these little guys, and their adult weevils make notches on the edges of leaves as they feed, and then they lay eggs. So it's their larvae that burrow below ground into plant nodules that cause yield loss. So these adults are tough to find, but looking for notched leaves is a little bit easier. And they actually prefer faba beans. So if you're growing those, that's the first place to look. But long story short, seed treatment is the most effective option to manage pea leaf weevils at this time. But it's pretty unlikely that at our current population levels in Manitoba, as this pest is establishing, that a seed treatment is going to be economical. So this is kind of something we'd like to get more information on, specifically this management practice, as well as its impact on weevils by conducting seed treatment trials in peas through the on-farm network. Also this year, John Glowacki is initiating a pea leaf weevil survey for Manitoba so we can help farmers make more informed management decisions based on population levels of weevils in our fields. So if you're an agronomist listening in today and want to be a part of that survey, please do reach out. I'm sure we could use extra eyes. And with that, I'd like to kind of move into my closing topic, which is dry bean nitrogen nutrition. So I do apologize to all the dry bean growers out there that stuck around to the very end to hear the most exciting results, I feel. Dry beans are poor nitrogen fixers, and as a result, we're going to manage them like non-legume crops. So common practice is to apply N fertilizer at a rate of about 70 pounds of N per acre. Recommendations kind of vary by region. So in Ontario, the recommendations to not add any additional nitrogen. In North Dakota, recommendations are based on whether or not beans have been inoculated. So fertilizer to a total N rate of 70 pounds or adding 40 pounds if inoculant is used. And we really wanted some made in Manitoba recommendations. So in 2017, small plot studies were started through Kristen's Pulse Agronomy Lab at the U of M. 5 rates of fertilizer were applied in pinto and navy beans at Carmen and Portage over 3 years. Residual nitrate in the top 2 feet are reported here for each site, and they ranged anywhere from 23 to 56 pounds per acre soil contribution on top of the fertilizer rates. I should mention that there's another second study that's recently started up at Brandon and Carberry sites, investigating different N and P rates for beans in Westman. But also at Kristen's lab, 2 inoculants were investigated containing rhizobia specific to dry beans in pinto, navy, and black beans. And this study is still ongoing, and results from 2021 are being processed. So for that full suite of results, you're going to have to stay tuned for a little bit later this year. As those trials in the small plot world were developing, complementary on-farm trials were started in 2019, testing ranges of fertilizer rates farmers were interested in. And those are listed kind of right here in this row. So far we've had 5 trials looking at nitrogen fertilizer rates on farm in pintos, navies, or blacks. We've also had 1 trial in 2019 testing out that Boss peat inoculant on farm. Before I get into the yield results, I'd like to touch on nodulation in the fertilizer trials. So these here are the 5 on-farm network trials. And then at the end is the summary of the 3 years, 2 sites for the small plot trials. So it's the average values there. Along the bottom are the different nitrogen rates applied. And if we account for soil residual nitrogen, we also get these for total N that was available. So first thing to go into talking about nodulation, these trials evaluating different fertilizer rates were not inoculated, but on farm, we're often seeing good to excellent nodulation ratings. So here nodulation is rated on a scale of 0 to 4, where 4 is excellent nodulation. Small plot trials on the end here, they were hosted on sites with generally less dry bean history than the on-farm trials. So what it kind of looks like is despite dry beans not typically being inoculated in Manitoba, our soil rhizobia populations appear to be adapting to repeated exposure of the crop. So this leads to the question of how much of a contribution biologically fixed nitrogen is playing a role in dry bean N nutrition. Because as these N rate applied increase, our nodulation rates are decreasing in crop. So if you're growing dry beans and you have a history of them, even if you don't have a history of them, dig up plants at flowering and see if you have any nodulation working for you in your fields as we explore this a bit further. And on to the yield results. These are the same order of trials and same order of N rates. Now I'm just showing the yields on the side here. So in those on-farm trials, we had 3 sites where we did not see a response to N rate and 2 opposite yield responses. In small plot trials, yield was only increased at the greatest rate of nitrogen applied. So those trials where yield didn't respond, those 3 trials, the economical decision there would have been to not apply any additional nitrogen, since we're really not seeing yield increases to pay for that added input cost. At the 2020 significant trial, yield was reduced at the highest N rate. So if we include the residual nitrogen level from the spring soil test, this treatment had a total of 140 pounds N per acre available to the crop. And the thought here was that added nitrogen under that field's growing conditions in 2020 just resulted in prolonged vegetative growth that delayed maturity and didn't translate to yield in the end. At the significant trial in 2021, yield increased at the highest rate of 70 pounds of N applied. Adding in that spring residual, again, it's 140 pounds of nitrogen per acre available to the crop. So this was an economical response where the highest rate of N applied resulted in about a $25 per acre return, one with a pinto bean sell price of 40 cents a pound and an N at a rate of 50 cents a pound. So throughout the season, there were visible differences in plant vigor and maturity, and this translated into yield at the end of the season. So here in this drone shot, you might be able to see those 0 N check strips that are much paler from the field view. So this year, we also tracked nitrate in the top foot throughout the season in this trial, and we did find that it was pretty stable. So we're expecting that mineralized nitrogen contributed to less under these drought conditions, and that's why we might be seeing a yield response to added N fertilizer in this case. So in other years with better moisture, mineralization might be providing nitrogen to the crop in such quantities that we're not really seeing responses to applied N. So let's talk about small plot trials because there's more to unpack here than just these quick averages. In over 2 sites in 3 years, yield was increased at the rate of 140 pounds N per acre applied, which was an increase of about 15% over the 0 N check. Looking at that in a little bit more detail, yield as a percent of that non-fertilized 0 N control was a tool that you can use to reduce environmental variability in the data. So by doing this and running it through the stats, we can see that yield was maximized already at the lowest rate of nitrogen applied, which was 35 pounds of N per acre. Including the soil residual, that was an equivalent of 60 to 90 pounds. Adding in those economics, again, assuming a cost of nitrogen of 50 cents a pound and a bean sell price of about 35 cents a pound, the return on investment was statistically the same for all of the rates of nitrogen application. So that tells us that the economic optimum in this case was actually not fertilizing at all. But I want to explore that 0 N control a little bit more. It's highlighted in orange here because the yield was on average 2,700 pounds per acre, which is great. Based on that, the total nitrogen uptake in that control for that crop would have needed was estimated to be 64 to 170 pounds per acre. From the residual soil nitrogen, since there was none extra applied, 23 to 56 pounds were available in the top 2 feet. So this is a resulting deficit of 8 to 130 pounds per acre. Post-harvest, soil samples were taken again and found that there was a residual nitrate in the zero-N treatment of about 20 to 60 pounds per acre. So this surplus post-harvest is indicating to us that there was sufficient for nitrogen for the crop, and that it acquired that nitrogen through either biological end fixation, mineralization, and deeper than 2 feet, or a combination of all 3. So this study was from 2017 to 2019. And again, here it's looking like mineralization is playing an important part in driving nitrogen nutrition. And that 2021 on-farm trial where mineralization was likely didn't occur because of drought conditions, and we saw that response to nitrogen fertilizer, they're kind of all coming together to support that mineralization theory a bit. But let's talk about those inoculant options quickly. So here are the nodulation results for the Agronomy Lab's inoculant trial. The 2021 results are still being analyzed, and Carmen 2019 had very poor establishment, so it was excluded. So really, we've just got the results from 2020 at Carmen and Melita. And there was no change in nodulation with any treatment at Carmen, but in Melita, the Primo GX2 inoculant improved nodulation over both the Czech and the Boss peat inoculant. And there was no difference between the Boss peat and the untreated. In terms of yield, there was no difference in Carmen 2019 or 2020. And at Melita, the improved nodulation from that Primo inoculant resulted in more than a 700 pound per acre yield advantage across market classes. I should also mention here that I don't believe Verdesian's Primo GX2 inoculant is available to Canadian farmers at this time, but it is something that's in the pipeline and that is being researched. And then at the one on-farm trial we had investigating inoculant available to farmers, there were no nodulation differences, nor yield differences between beans treated with Boss peat inoculant and untreated. So from those trials so far, there are some emerging guidelines for the research. The first option for farmers is to not apply any additional nitrogen or inoculant. In the small plot research, this resulted in 86 to 93% of maximum yield. It was also the economic optimum and at the small plot research and at 4 out of 5 on-farm trials. A second option would be to add nitrogen at a rate of 35 pounds to reach that 70 pounds of N total as a combination of soil residual and applied. This did reach maximum yield in the small plot and overall didn't really reduce nodulation too greatly in on-farm trials. And then options 3 and 4, working in that dry bean inoculant, currently need more research as product availability increases, but they are avenues we're interested in investigating. Just to wrap up, you can find more information about all of the on-farm trials and dig into these results at manitobapulse.ca/on-farm network. It is, as Daryl mentioned, a fully searchable and filterable database. And thanks for your time today. I went way over time, so I apologize. Here's my contact information. And if you're interested in participating in the trials, please do reach out to any of us, but here's Leanne's contact for those trials.
Thanks, Laura. There's a couple of questions if you have a few minutes to answer them.
I do. I'm going to try and figure out how to see them.
If you go on the bottom bar, the Q&A, you can open that and you should be able to open the chat as well. But I can read them out to you if you'd like.
So I covered a lot of ground. I'll start with Dave's question.
Okay.
Soybean architecture type consistent between trials. Any differences in results if grower was using an upright variety versus a more bushy variety carrying pods on lateral branches? That is actually something we want to investigate with both seeding rate and row spacing trials for soybeans, taking a look at variety effect within those trials. The trouble is that right now there is such a low frequency of response that if we might not get a complete answer to that question. So I guess my answer is we're looking into it. Soybean seeding rates. cooler soil temperatures in spring and shorter growing seasons affect the seeding rate recommendations? Or does it just affect percent survivability? Northwest Manitoba, north of, yeah. Another one that Kristen's lab looked into, that agronomist in resident program, was looking at late planting of shorter maturity varieties, which was really interesting. And we need to kind of, I didn't have time to touch on it today, but I would say if you're expecting less survivability, less plants to establish because you're going into cooler soil temperatures in the spring, to try to account for that in your seeding rate, put more seeds in the ground if you're expecting that fewer are making it up, just so you can at least hit that 140,000 live plants per acre. Because if you fall below that, as soon as you do that, you're kind of neat, like mentioned a couple times, the rest of your management just really needs to be excellent in order to combat weeds and produce yield. I don't know if that directly answered your question or if I interpreted it right. I'm not sure if I've missed any questions, but feel free to reach out to me directly.
Harry had a
That
question. With the push on pea acres to increase, what is your recommendation for peas in the crop rotation in light of one farmer saying 1 in 8 is what works best for them?
Was that for me or for Syama? Anyways, peas in the crop rotation, minimum time between peas should be 4 to 5 years, and that's without Aphanomyces. And we say 4 to 5 years, that's just to bring down your Microsphaerella blight disease levels in a field, to manage that kind of severity, as well as some of those other root rots. But as soon as you have Aphanomyces, you need to push that rotation to 8 or greater. So it's kind of good practice if you have peas in your field and you're seeing a lot of root rot moving in, get them tested just to determine if you do have Aphanomyces, because that's really going to impact how much of a break you take between crops, and also some of those other host crops that you might be thinking about in host weed species in terms of management. Yeah, so not too frequently, but they're a great option to work in because of that nitrogen fixation benefit and because they're great phosphorus scavengers. But
All right, thanks for answering those questions, Laura. If there's any other questions that came up from any of the presentations this morning, feel free to reach out to Daryl or Laura or myself, and we can either direct them to the appropriate person or answer them ourselves. But I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your time and your expertise. And of course, thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you got something out of it and learned something new. Daryl, was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up this morning?
No, thanks again, everyone. Pay attention to things coming out on social media and our magazines. Again, if you're interested in an on-farm test, get a hold of Leanne, and let's hope for a slow melt, but a total melt. See you in the field this year, this season sometime.